Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Tuesday, October 23rd, 2018 Placer County Board of Supervisors meeting. We'll begin the morning with a flag salute led by Supervisor Cooler.
Under God, indivisible, liberty and justice for all.
We'll now move to the consent agenda. All items on the consent agenda have been recommended for approval by the County Executive Department. All items will be approved by a single roll call vote. Anyone may ask to address consent items prior to the board taking action, and the item may be moved for discussion. Any board members have consent items they wish to have be removed? Seeing none, does anyone in the audience have a consent item that they wish to move for discussion? Seeing none, I'll ask for a second. It's been moved and seconded to approve the consent agenda. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, any abstentions? Hearing none. Abstain. Oh, one abstention. Now is the time for public comment. Persons may address the board on items not on this agenda. Please limit comments to 3 minutes per person, since the time allocated for public comment is 15 minutes. If all comments cannot be heard within the 15-minute time limit, the public comment period will be taken up at the end of the regular session. The board is not permitted to take any action on items addressed under public comment. Any public comment today? Wow, we're off to a good start. Thank you. Board member and county executive reports. Any board member reports? Yeah, Supervisor Wagner.
Three of us went back to Hillsdale College last week to look at their campus, sit on site, and have to talk to top management. But Todd Johnson and I back spent a full day with him. Talked to top staff. I think it was a great visit. Right.
All right, thank you. Anyone else?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to say that I'm honored this morning to have my grandmother, Josephine, with us today. She's 98 years old, and back in World War II, she was one of those wonderful ladies that worked and put together airplanes during the war. So I'm thankful to still have her today in general, but she's with me for this week. So.
Okay. Well, welcome, Bomber Betty. The 9:05 timed item. Okay. We're gonna be one of the persons that wants to address us on this is not here yet. He's on his way, so we'll move on to. Let's see. We'll go ahead and take up department item. Yeah. Administrative services, procurement, purchase of safety products, and miscellaneous industrial supplies. Fastenal Company of Auburn, California. Good morning, sir.
I'm purchasing. I'm here today to request your approval of an agreement with Fastenal Company of Auburn. Variety of operational equipment items in the amount of $540. Your first June 30th. Money is provided by departments in their contract amount annually or additional 1-year term. As a matter of history for using Fastenal for several years for the purchase of these types of products, but they've been under multiple different agreements. And at this point, we're recommending to your board that we consolidate all of those different purchases together under one agreement so that we have a more expedited and equitable way to bill and match those purchases with the receipts. This makes it easier for departments to bill. It also improves their ability to track those purchases. These purchases are based off a cooperative agreement through the National Intergovernmental Purchasing Alliance, or NIPA. With that, I'd be happy to stand for any questions your board may have.
Any comments, questions from board members? Anyone in the audience wish to address us on this item? I'll ask for a motion.
Move approval.
It's been moved and seconded to approve department item 5, administrative services procurement. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, any abstentions? Hearing none, we will now move to our let's see. Well, that's a long, yeah, that's all. Okay, now we'll move to item 6 under Department Health and Human Services, revised mental health triage grant programs. Good morning.
Good morning, Chair Holmes, board members, Mr. Leopold, Ms. Jalal. Twyla Abrahamson, Director of the Children's System of Care, here today to be presenting this item. So on June 5th of this year, your board approved 3 revenue agreements with the Mental Health Oversight and Accountability Commission, or the OAC, for delivery of crisis triage services. These 3 grants were awarded to support and expand the existing adult mental health crisis team, to create a child and family mobile crisis team, and to partner with the Placer County Office of Education and Roseville school districts to be one of 4 counties in the state to create a school-county collaborative to deliver mental health services. Directly after the board meeting in June, Placer County was notified by the OAC that the grant funding to support these efforts was decreased by 29% in the California-approved state budget. The OAC did not meet until July 26th to decide how to reapportion the grant funds. It eventually decided to fund all the grants previously awarded, but decreased them all by 29%. This in turn required all 3 grantees, the adult system of care, the children's system of care, and the school and county partners, to resume planning to redesign the programs to reflect the lessened funding. The action before you today is to request approval for these grants in the lessened amounts. An additional item will come before your board in another month or so, in which we will be recommending approval of the Mental Health Services Act annual plan, which will include a recommendation approved by the Campaign for Community Wellness and the MHSA Steering Committee to approve local MHSA funds to backfill the 29% reduction for both the adult crisis team and for the family mobile crisis team. The Campaign for Community Wellness and the MHSA Steering Committee, however, voted to use local MHSA dollars only for the school-county partnership triage at 10% of the reduction over the term of the 4 years. So we'll be bringing that item back to you. However, for today, we are requesting that your board take the following actions, and I don't know if you want to take them all 3 at once or separately. But the first would be to approve a revenue agreement with the Mental Health Services Oversight and Accountability Commission, or the OAC, for the Adult Mental Health Triage Grant Program from date of execution through November 30th, 2021, in an amount not to exceed $799,922.38. Authorize the Director of Health and Human Services to sign the agreement and to sign subsequent amendments up to $79,992 with the agreement subject matter and scope of work with risk management and county council occurrence. That's the first. Would you like to hear all 3 or just the one?
Do we need to take them?
Why don't you take them separately?
Yeah, we're going to take them separately. So we'll ask any comments or questions about 6A, item 1A. Seeing none, anyone in the audience? All right, we will ask for a roll call.
Second.
Moved and seconded to approve item 6A, adopt a resolution of approving a revenue agreement with the Mental Health Services Oversight and Accountability Commission for the Adult Mental Health Triage Grant Program. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Hearing none, we'll move to item B.
The second would be to approve a revenue agreement with the OAC for the Child Mental Health Grant Program, also from the date of execution through November 30th, 2021, in an amount not to exceed $1,036,123.02. Authorize the Director of Health and Human Services to sign the agreement and to sign subsequent amendments up to $100,000 consistent with the agreement's subject matter and scope with County Council concurrence. And that would be the second.
Any questions? Anyone from the public wish to address this item? Seeing none, I'll bring it back for action.
Move approval.
It's moved and seconded to approve a revenue agreement with the Mental Health Services Oversight and Accountability Commission for the Child Mental Health Triage Grant Program. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Hearing none, we'll now move to item C.
This one would be approve a revenue agreement with the OAC for the County School Mental Health Triage Grant Program from date of execution through November 30th, 2022, in an amount not to exceed $5,293,367.35. Authorize the Director of Health and Human Services to sign the agreement and also to sign subsequent amendments up to $100,000 consistent with the agreement's subject matter and scope of work with risk management and County Council concurrence.
Any questions from board members? Anyone in the public wish to address this item? Seeing none, I'll ask for a motion.
So moved.
It's moved and seconded to approve a revenue agreement with the Mental Health Services Oversight and Accountability Commission for the County School Mental Health Triage Grant Program. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you very much.
Now we'll move to our 9:05 timed item since parties have arrived. This is Health and Human Service update, in-home supportive services, safety out, emergency kits. Good morning, Colby.
Good morning, Chair Holmes, members of the board. My name is Colby Hightoff, and I'm a manager with Health and Human Services Adult System of Care. I'm here to present you with an update regarding the Safely Out pilot project we launched in 2017. The Adult System of Care took advantage of an opportunity to purchase and pilot Safely Out emergency kits to enhance our emergency preparedness plan for in-home supportive services, or IHSS, recipients. These kits, produced by Citizen Voice, assist first responders with quick notification if a vulnerable person needs help or has been evacuated during a disaster. Recipients of this kit fill out large placards to hang on their front doors in emergency situations, including natural or man-made disasters. Currently, Placer County has approximately 3,250 residents who receive IHSS services. In preparation for fire season, the kits were distributed to vulnerable residents in the East Placer Mountain rural regions first. Our Tahoe region IHSS social worker handed them out to those recipients within a couple of days. The placards were distributed to the West Placer areas as the annual IHSS reassessments came due. IHSS has distributed about 75% of the 3,000 kits to date. People in Eastern Placer gladly accepted them, while Western Placer residents sometimes refused, as they did not feel as vulnerable to disaster. The $10 kits generated good discussions with the IHSS recipients and about disaster preparedness. For expansion considerations of this pilot project, Health and Human Services recommends developing a regional approach with input and support from first responders. Gary Diedrich with Citizen Voice is here if the board members have any questions about the emergency kits. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for Colby? Seeing none?
Well, Mr. Chairman, if I may, just quickly?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, I see
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to hear back on the results of the pilot program. I asked Gary last year if we could get together with his organization and target those most vulnerable from a more of a demographic standpoint, if you will, through our in-home supportive services system care. And what was fascinating is as the year went on, we realized that We have folks who have a perception vulnerability that is not just demographic but geographic. And so getting back together, it was obvious that if we were looking to really address the need not just of our vulnerable community, but also the need of first responders themselves, and to help avoid first responders putting themselves in a position of jeopardy by having to clear houses in a wildfire type of event, that perhaps looking at expanding this program geographically as opposed to the demographic focus that we had previously might make the most sense. And so I asked Gary to meet with us a couple weeks ago, figure out how they have successfully integrated in other areas with first responder teams, and interestingly, where they've had the most success isn't in high fire risk areas, but rather high flood risk areas, where once again, knowing that people are out of their home is not just obviously a positive result for the person who would otherwise be in an inundated area, be it for fire or flood, but also it's the time savings and the effort savings, the manpower savings for the first responders when they are able to look at a home from the street, realize there's nobody in that home, we can clear a street and get the heck out of here a whole lot faster. And so I asked if Gary would come up, make the drive up this morning to talk with us a little bit about the experience working with the county and where they've had success in working with first responders in disaster-prone areas, and what we might be able to do to expand this program to our fire-prone areas, knowing that while we do have some flood-prone areas, that's not our biggest concern up here. So with that, I'd like to ask Gary to address our board, say a few words on this.
Thank you much, and I want to thank the folks at In-Home Supportive Services. You folks have done a fantastic job at distributing these. Thanks for just a few moments of your time. You remember, this is what the kit looks like.
Yeah.
And to specifically, Supervisor Euler, address your, first of all, I want to thank the board for your strong support of this. I mean, never more than in the last 12 months have we seen what California is about in terms of fire danger. I mean, I was in the Napa Sonoma fires, down the Santa Barbara fires. It's unbelievable, really, what we've had to deal with and what we're looking at going forward, and you folks know that as well as anybody. As far as geographic, let me give you two examples of that, Kirk, if I might. One is the response to the Angora fire, when we actually literally went up the day the community meeting was being held at the junior high school in South Lake Tahoe, and nobody was there except the people who were residents and 1,000 fire trucks, okay, and us. And so we distributed 700 of these at the community meeting at the door. People were tearful receiving them. It was fantastic. And that's an example, Kirk, of an immediate response to a danger. Now, as a pre-program kind of response, and this is where I think we're going up here, Kirk has kind of identified Auburn North into the mountains. How do we protect folks geographically? Here's an example. Tomorrow morning, I'll meet with the fire chief for Isleton, where Sacramento County's OES has decided that Delta flood-prone area, everybody in that area should have one of these kits. And so Walnut Grove, Isleton, all those geographically vulnerable areas are going to be getting one of these, courtesy of Sac County OES and a state DWR grant. So there's an example, Supervisor Euler, of what it means to do that geographically. Now, finally, demographically. Who are the vulnerable? We simply define them, and the RAND Corporation, who's endorsed our project as a best practice nationwide, likes the concept that we simply identify the vulnerable as what they are. Anyone who would have a difficulty evacuating themselves in any natural or man-made disaster. Typically, this involves frail elderly, people with disabilities, families with young children. And so while people, for example, in West Roseville may not think, well, I'm not in a giant fire zone, you know what they are close to? Things like the Roseville Rail Yard. Well, if we had a major spill, how are all those vulnerable people going to evacuate themselves rapidly? So sometimes it's an education process for people, as well as, hey, you know what? You might need more help than you think in a disaster. So thank you again. We look forward to the expansion of the project, and we'll do all we can to partner with you and SS and the OES folks and others to do that.
Thank you, Gary. So what I'm asking this morning, Mr. Chairman, is essentially just board's concurrence that our OES folks work with Gary to make appropriate introductions across our first responder community, and to work to figure out, as Gary identified, they were successful in getting some state grant money to help pay for these kits in the flood-prone areas, and we look for those opportunities to help pay for these kits and get them distributed in our fire-prone areas.
So did you want to make that in the form of a motion?
Well, it's
Just
not
nodding
formally
yes?
an action
Yeah.
item, it's just kind of board concurrence and general board direction that the program is worth looking into opportunities to expand.
I concur.
Chairman Holmes, yeah, I absolutely concur and want to formally offer the assistance from District 5, from me and Lindsay and Jocelyn, and our relationships that we have within the more fire-prone communities of our county to assist with that.
Great. Well, thank you. It looks like we've got concurrence. So thank you very much, Mr. Dietrich, for coming forward and giving a very informative presentation to us. And thanks for, well, who doesn't want to come up to Tahoe this time of year? So, so thank you very much. Thanks, Kurt, for bringing this forward. And thank you, Colby. So now we'll move to our 9:10 timed item, the presentation, Tahoe Regional Planning Agency Development Rights Strategic Initiative. Well, you're not that one guy.
I'm not. But my name's Jennifer Merchant.
That's right.
Chairman Holmes and members of the board. Pleased to be here and pleased also to introduce that guy.
Okay.
His name is John Hester, and he is the Chief Operating Officer of the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency, and he and his staff have been working for the past couple years on this Development Rights Strategic Initiative. Their board is positioned to take action on it later this week. There are some excellent changes to TRPA's code that will really make the process for development in the Tahoe Basin, especially in Placer County, more streamlined, more effective as it relates to housing. And so we invited him here today to give your board a preview of what he expects his board's action to be later this week. So welcome, John Hester. Thanks.
Good morning, John.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board, Mr. Leopold, Ms. Schwab. I'm that guy.
You're that one guy.
Let's see. And I just push. Okay. That's okay. Got it. This is what I'm going to talk about. I will do my best to finish ahead of schedule, which is what this is all about, is doing things ahead of schedule. So this is what, we had a working group, and this is the mission that they set forth about 2.5 years ago for this project. It's one of the 7 strategic initiatives our board addressed at their retreat 2 years ago, and asked us to work on. So I won't read these to you, but it's about, like Jennifer said, making the development process more efficient and effective, and in order to get environmentally beneficial redevelopment at the lake, in the Lake Tahoe Basin. So right next door, if you haven't seen it, I know you were busy opening a trail yesterday, but if you haven't seen it, this is what the hotel next door used to look like, and this is what it looks like now. It not only looks better, it's better economically, it's better scenically, and it's better environmentally. You can see the pictures on the bottom there of stormwater improvements being put in. So that's the kind of thing that we want to see more of, and we want to see it happen quicker. So the process that our group went through was we literally brought in the guy who wrote the book on development rights. And surprisingly, there was a chapter about Tahoe. Not surprisingly, there was a chapter about Tahoe in there. And his assessment right up front with the group was, you have probably the most complex development rights system in the country. So that's where we started. So everything we did was an improvement over that. So our group got 24 different features of development rights systems presented to them. They broke into groups. We had a public group as well. And out of that, they came up with a consensus of 5 alternatives that we looked at and analyzed. The working group consisted of half of our governing board, the Regional Plan Implementation Committee, 2 appointees of the Advisory Planning Commission. Jennifer was one of them, and we appreciate her help and her wisdom as we went through this process. A lot of good examples of how our system did and didn't work. And then these are the other groups that were involved. So they came up with 8 goals. I'm not going to read every one of them, but they were all trying to capture the different perspectives of all the different stakeholders, everything from environmental benefit to meeting the goals of our recently adopted regional plan, reducing regulations and those sort of things. You have them in your handout. So the results were five recommendations on changes to the system. I will explain each one of these here, but these were the results that came out of that process. So the first one was to allow exchanges between types of development rights. Our system puts development rights into three buckets. And by development rights, I mean the right to develop commercial square footage or a hotel room we call lodging, or we have a nice term that means nothing to anybody but those of us on inside baseball called tourist accommodation units. So, and residential units, which are single-family, multifamily homes. Those stayed in separate buckets, and you couldn't move from one to the other unless there were certain specific circumstances. So one of the recommendations was put all those together so that they can move between type of development so that it reflects the market, not just some arbitrary division into these three buckets that happened 20 years ago. So that was the first thing that came out of it, and we did this much like you would think of a currency exchange rate. These are exchange rates between types of those three types of development. So for example, 300 square feet of commercial would equal one hotel room or TAU as it is. So if Placer County, for example, feels like they have more commercial capacity than they need, but not enough hotel rooms, you can exchange them. So that's a huge improvement, we think, to the system. Those exchange rates were based predominantly on travel behavior so that there's no environmental impact. We also eliminated overlapping approvals. Some of the local jurisdictions in the Tahoe Basin said, well, even if TRPA approves this, we want to review it and approve it, and often that involved another fee, and then sometimes they exacted additional things from the applicant. So we removed that extra or overlapping local government review. We did put in what I call a safety net, so that a couple of the jurisdictions were worried that, well, if we open up this market, things might all move out of our jurisdiction and we'll lose our tax base. So we put in a safety net that at any time a local government, if it looks like a lot of development is moving out, they can come to the governing board and say, could you reinstate that? We don't think that'll happen, but it's there just as we're getting rid of this overlapping approval. We wanted to have a safety net there to make it acceptable. In the past, to move development rights, even if they were in the same bucket, to move them from one place to another, you also needed an approved project. So we've removed that requirement that you have to have an approved project. We've also allowed more groups to be development rights banks, much like CTC and the Nevada Division of State Lands. So if Placer County wants to do that, they can officially do that. What that does is allow you to take rights and hold them without them having to be tied to a property or a project. Private parties can hold rights too. They still have to be tied to a property. We also, to address housing, this wasn't exactly in the core mission of what we were working on, but housing being such a big issue for everybody, they said, well, while we're talking about our development rights were currently limited to what we call affordable and moderate. And we are, like you all, participating actively with the Mountain Housing Council, and they recommended this additional category up to, depending on the housing price, up to a higher level of the AMI or area median income. So we took that concept, and we have bonus units that we can distribute and allocations we can distribute. We said, no longer do you need an allocation if you're in that additional category, and we will put half of our bonus units into that pool. So we had a few criteria. They can't be used for short-term rentals, and we allowed them to be for both multi and single. They were before only for multi, and they have to be close to transit. So this is what, if you look across the whole Tahoe region, the affordable and moderate were there before. Like I said, we no longer require an allocation, and local achievable for multifamily and local achievable for single family. These are the figures we came up with. So we're going to make some of our units available for achievable as well as affordable and moderate. We are tomorrow, we have our Development Rights Working Group that we talked about, recommended all of these changes unanimously. Our Advisory Planning Commission, which you all have a representative on, recommended all of this unanimously. Our Regional Plan Implementation Committee, which you all also have a representative on, recommended this unanimously. And tomorrow, fingers crossed, our board will approve these regional plan amendments and these changes to these chapters of our Code of Ordinance. So we think it's a big improvement. We've worked very closely with your staff and representatives. We think it's going to be very helpful for you, and it's just kind of a pleasure to come here and tell you about this. If you want to read, I think we have a stack of reports going back about this high. If you really want to read them, there's the webpage.
Okay.
I didn't think so, but for the public who have insomnia, good stuff.
Right. Good.
The project lead is Jennifer Self. She really handles these questions way better than I do, but I'm here today to present that. Happy to answer any questions, and again, thank you for your participation in this.
Thank you, Mr. Hester. Any questions from board members, comments? Supervisor Montgomery.
Yeah, I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank that guy for all his work around this. I know that certainly when this first came up as an idea that we could sort of swap these various commodities amongst themselves, it was a pretty challenging concept, both for the local jurisdictions, the TRPA, but also really for the community and the public, because there were a lot of fears around what that could potentially mean. And I'm, while I think the devil's in the details and how this plays out in the future will really inform how we implement this in the future, I think we've done and when I say we, I'm not part of it, you guys have done just an amazing job on this, and I'm really very pleased to see this come forward, and just wanted to say thank you, and thank you to all the participants in this process.
Well, thank you, Supervisor.
Seeing no more comments from board members, does anyone in the audience wish to make any comments regarding this issue? I see none. On behalf of the board, really appreciate your presentation, coming here today, and I'm glad to see this kind of movement where it makes things easier for development in the region that makes sense. So thank you very much. Now we'll move to our 9:30 timed item. This is County Executive Capital Projects Advisory Committee for Eastern Placer County.
Good morning.
Well, Ms. Casey, good morning.
Mr. Chair, members of the board, Erin Casey with the County Executive Office, here to present this item to you today. I'm excited to be here and presenting the Group 2 projects that are being recommended by the Capital Projects Advisory Committee for Eastern Placer County. I'd like to, as the presentation's being pulled up, acknowledge some of our partners that have been a part of this process for the last several months to years, actually. So first and foremost is Cindy Gustafson with the North Lake Tahoe Resort Association. I see her sitting back there. She works very closely with me on this committee. We co-chair it together, developing the agenda, working together to ensure the committee has all the information that they need as they work diligently to make recommendations to your board on capital projects. Also, I'd like to acknowledge members of the CAP committee who may be here today. Thank you for those who participate, give a lot of your time. Many of our members are volunteers from the community, and we do appreciate the time that they're giving to this process to ensure that community priorities are being represented and funded through this program. And there we go. Here is the presentation. First, I'll provide your board with an overview of the presentation for you today. I'd like to start by just reminding you the details of the CAP committee. I know we've talked about this at length for the last year, but just for your benefit and those in the room, I'd just like to provide a summary of how we got here today with the committee itself. Also, the grant review process, which started earlier this year. I'd like to review with your board also how we got to this point today, and the work that the CAP committee has done to evaluate projects that have been submitted through our process and bringing those forward to your board for recommendation. There are 2 actions for your board's consideration today. The first is to approve the Group 2 CAP committee recommendations, and then the second is to approve a budget revision for the allocation of TOT funds in the total amount of $175,000 to the Department of Public Works and Facilities for the Squaw Valley Park project. This is a project that is included in the Group 2 projects that are being recommended for your board's consideration today. Most projects that Public Works had applied for funds through this program had been included in final budget. This is the exception to that, which is why there is a budget revision before you today, should you approve the Group 2 projects that are being recommended. Committee details. The committee is co-chaired with the North Lake Tahoe Resort Association. I work very closely with Cindy Gustafson on the committee, as I mentioned already. There are 13 seats included on the committee, and the members represent a broad cross-section of the community here in Eastern Placer County. That includes business associations, several special districts, ski resorts, and then there are the Resort Association at-large seats, as well as Placer County at-large seats. This is a list of the committee members, the seats that they represent, as well as the represented areas and background. And I think this is important to highlight because, again, you can see that this does represent a broad cross-section of the community, folks that represent different areas and neighborhoods and communities within Eastern Placer County, from Donner Summit all the way down to Kings Beach. You have business owners in here. You have representatives from special districts that are actively engaged in implementing projects consistent with our master plan that are represented here, as well as our resort communities here. Committee objectives include reviewing grant applications for capital projects as have been recommended to your board, ensuring that those projects are consistent with the tourism master plan. Your board approved grant criteria earlier this year, and that criteria was to ensure that as projects were being evaluated by the committee, they were consistent with master plan priorities that have been approved by your board in 2015, and also was informed largely by the community at that time. The committee also works to leverage state, federal, and local match funds. So matching elements are very important to this program. There is a minimum match requirement, which is 10% currently for the program, but many of the applicants exceeded that minimum match requirement and have for a long time. The committee also holds public meetings to review these projects and further engage the community, so they meet on a monthly basis. Those meetings rotate in terms of location to ensure broad participation, and they are public. We have had a lot of participants from the community come out, participate in our process, weigh in on the projects, and provide comments to that committee as part of the process. And then ultimately recommending these projects to your board for consideration. How do we get where we are today? The CAP committee was formed by your board in January of 2018. At the same time, we released the grant application. 29 applications were received at the end of March, which was the deadline for that process. We had over $36 million in requests, which was significant. We were excited about the level of engagement and participation from the community in the program. But we had $5.8 million in available TOT, actually a large sum of money, but compared to the requests, sort of made it seem somewhat insignificant. However, what that tells you is that the committee had its work cut out for it. You have $36 million in requests, the $5.8 million to work with. That criteria that your board approved is very important to help guide the committee. The committee decided to focus on projects that ranked higher as part of their process. And that recommendation, referred to as the Group 1 projects, was approved or recommended by the committee in June of this year, and then brought forward to your board for approval in July of 2018. Your board did approve those recommended projects, and the total TOT was $4.9 million associated with those projects. The committee then, after that, reevaluated the Group 2 projects that remained as part of the process, and those are the projects I'm bringing forward to your board for consideration today. I also want to just provide you with an overview of how the committee evaluated the different projects that were provided or included in the proposals. As I mentioned already, the Group 1 projects were those that were top-ranked proposals, had significant support from the committee itself. And so the committee decided to try to move those forward so that they weren't held back by projects that ranked lower or required additional information and vetting before recommendation was to be made. Other projects were eliminated earlier this year. Also, they either didn't meet minimum criteria as established by the board or weren't appropriate for the program. I'd like to talk with your board now about the review of those Group 2 projects. After your board took action to approve Group 1 projects in the amount of $4.9 million, there was less than $850,000 left in available TOT for the Group 2 projects. There were still, however, about $1.6 million in requests on the table. So again, the committee had its work cut out for it. So what the committee members asked for, requested, was that the Group 2 applicants who were still in consideration resubmit a proposed budget and scale that back if it were feasible for them to do that. Most of the applicants did do that. There were a couple who felt that it would be infeasible for them to reduce their budgets. But the bulk of those applicants that were still participating in the process were able to revise their budgets, resubmitted those, and then the CAP committee was able to evaluate those proposals against the remaining funds available as well as the rank for each of the projects. This is a list of the 4 projects that the CAP committee did recommend for your board's consideration. 2 of those are projects through the Department of Public Works. One is the Winter Trail Access Program. It allows for repaving in Squaw Valley Park so that we can continue to provide snow removal services in the parking area as well as the trail adjacent to the parking lot so that people have access to that area in the wintertime. Also, a feasibility study for the Tahoe City Firehouse property. I think you might hear from facility staff here shortly an update on that project. But those funds would support a feasibility study to assist Department of Public Works in better understanding what projects might be possible for Station 51. There were also 2 projects that were non-county projects. One is the Tahoe Cross Country Ski Education Association. That's the first project at the top. Your board has approved funds in the past for this project. They are in the process of completing an EIR. The Tahoe City PUD is the lead agency on that project. Placer County, a responsible agency. So this would be a continuation to further fund that environmental analysis and public outreach for that project. And then the Squaw Valley Ski Museum Foundation is another project up here that was recommended by the CAP committee. They have been in the process of submitting initial studies to the Community Development Resources Agency so that CEDRA can make a determination on the level of environmental analysis required. The proposal included completion of the environmental analysis and design of the project for this. And your board has approved funds in the past, over $300,000 in TOT for this project since 2008. Since the committee made that recommendation to your board, there has been new information that has become available specifically on the Squaw Valley Ski Museum project. Specifically related to the level of environmental analysis that may be required, and that's what I want to point out for your board's consideration today. In the initial proposal, there was a line item for a mitigated negative declaration for about $5,000 to complete that environmental analysis. After the proposal was submitted, staff had some conversations with the Community Development Resources Agency staff who were working with the ski museum on their environmental questionnaire application and learned that it wasn't yet determined the level of environmental analysis that would be required. So it could be a mitigated neg deck, could be an EIR, something more significant. In order for CEDRA staff to be able to make that determination, however, they needed a completed environmental questionnaire application, including a completed project description, which to my knowledge, we still don't have at this date. The initial application environmental questionnaire was submitted to CEDRA on December 22nd, 2015. So it's been an ongoing process working between CEDRA staff and the Museum Foundation to better understand the scope and scale of the project so that a determination could be made on the level of environmental analysis. And as I've said, we still don't have that information to date. If an EIR were to be required for this project, it would change the project proposal in a significant way. The timeline that was included in the proposal allowed for an environmental review at the mitigated neg deck level about 30 to 60 days to complete that process, and then the additional work and schedule was based on that timeline. If an EIR were required, the timeline and schedule associated with that could be very different, and the budget that was submitted would likely have to be revised significantly also to accommodate for that. So county staff worked very closely, me in particular, with the North Lake Tahoe Resort Association. As I said, we co-chair the CAP committee. I also work closely with the CAP committee chair and vice chair to talk about, okay, here's the new information that I have. I believe it's material to the project. It changes it significantly from what was originally proposed to the CAP committee. How should we proceed at this point? What should next steps be? And so requested that input from those individuals. And as a part of that process, we determined that the applicant should be invited to resubmit an application once the level of environmental analysis had been determined by CEDRA staff. And I'll skip to the next slide because it outlines this in more detail. So the applicant would not be required to wait for the next grant cycle. The funds would actually remain in reserve, so they wouldn't be allocated to another project. They would still be available for the organization. They would just have to resubmit their application and revise it consistent with the level of environmental analysis required. County and Resort Association staff would continue to provide guidance. Our office does work very closely with grantees. We have developed several templates and guides along the way to assist them in understanding what documentation is required as it relates to receiving payment, getting invoices in and getting them processed quickly, progress reports, and some of the information that we require so that we can report back to the community. This is something that we would continue to do and work closely with the organization where we could provide assistance to help them along the way. Once that proposal were resubmitted, that would go back to the Capital Projects Advisory Committee for consideration. So they'd have the opportunity to re-review a proposal, or I should say review a revised proposal consistent with the environmental determination that had been made, and then determine whether or not they felt that that project should be recommended to your board for consideration at a future time. And then as the co-chairs, Cindy and I do, we would evaluate that proposal and that recommendation to your board before bringing that forward. I do want to mention that EJ Evaldi with CEDRA is here and would be available once I conclude my presentation to answer any question that your board may have related to the items I just discussed on the environmental analysis and the environmental questionnaire. But before we get there, I would like to speak with you too about the deed restriction associated with Squaw Valley Park. This is something we have talked with your board about in the past, and I'd just like to give you an update on some steps staff have taken to better understand the nature of the deed restriction and see if there isn't something we can do to make this a little bit clearer in terms of what our next steps might be associated with this, not only for the county but also for the applicant in this case. County staff did meet with Congressman McClintock's staff recently, specifically Kimberly Pruitt met with us to talk a bit about the project, to better understand the deed restriction as we understand it, to better understand the scope and scale of the project as we understood it. And per that meeting, she requested information on the deed restriction, on the project, the current contract that we have with the organization, etc. That information was provided to Kimberly Pruitt for review. She did determine, after doing her own research and reviewing the information that we provided, that the deed restriction is in fact legislative and not administrative. She wanted to understand the differences there because based on that, there could be a different set of steps that would be required for the county and the applicant depending on the nature of that deed restriction. She also agreed to convene a meeting between Placer County staff and the museum staff to really discuss the deed restriction status, to really understand the nature of it, the implications of it, and what potential steps may be as it relates to Squaw Valley Park. And so that is something, in fact, that we have been coordinating with her recently. Our staff have been in communication with her, and we're actively working to try and schedule that meeting. In light of what I've discussed with you and some of those material changes, staff is recommending 3 of the 4 projects for your consideration today. And again, the Museum Foundation has been invited to resubmit their application once the environmental determination has been made. And again, those funds will remain in reserves and would be available for the organization should they reapply and the CAP committee and your board approve that in the future. The total recommended amount is $547,774 for 3 projects as listed here. Just to also note project highlights, these projects leverage over $210,000 in local, state, and federal funds. They include feasibility studies, environmental studies, and construction. There are 3 implementing agencies that were working in partnership on this. And these projects do provide winter access to trails and recreation, Nordic skiing, and also visitor amenities. Well, my clicker is no longer working, and I think that concludes my presentation at this point. So I'll go ahead and stop and answer any questions that your board may have. Thank you.
Any questions from board members? Oh.
Aaron, I do have one question for you. So just so I understand the context of the recommendation from the CAP committee regarding the Squaw Valley Ski Museum Foundation project, their application asked for $5,000 for environmental planning?
Correct.
And your concern is because CEDRA hasn't yet determined the level of that environmental document, that it could be significantly more.
Correct.
Maybe this is a question for EJ, but EJ, what's, just from your experience, what's the difference between an MND and a higher level, just in terms of timing, costs, complexity? I know that's like how long is a piece of string, but.
I'll give you the 30-second answer. For the record, Jeff Aldi with the Planning Services Division. I think Erin outlined the application process where it's at right now. I think she did that really well. Not until we get a complete application can we make an environmental determination, whether that's a mitigated negative declaration or an EIR. What we need to make sure is that we have a legally defensible document when we're done. Time frame, mitigated negative debt, as compared to an EIR, you're talking about 9 months to 18 months, give or take a couple of months on either end for those. So I don't know if there's any more you'd like me to add to that.
I think that probably gets to the concern about the time frame, and then just significantly more in terms of cost.
Correct.
Okay.
Much more expensive.
Okay, so this then brings my question back to Erin, I think, which is there a material difference between saying, yes, let's wait on this for not another round, but just as soon as this information is fully submitted and CEDRA has been able to process it and make a decision, is there a difference between saying, let's wait until that happens and then allocate the 150 or whatever additional amount may be requested based on the environmental document, or between saying today, for example, yes, let's allocate the 150, but hold it essentially in an escrow account and not have it be available until we have a determination around what that level of environmental document would require?
I think the difference there is the opportunity to vet the revised proposal by the CAP committee. So it gives them the opportunity to really look at it, because you're talking about changes to the scope, including every line item in the budget. You're talking about changes to the deliverables, also the schedule, and I think that your board would be well served by giving the CAP committee the opportunity to vet that, to ask questions of the applicant the way they have now, and then recommend or not moving forward with that application or something else altogether to your board.
Okay, thank you.
Any other comments or questions from board members? I see none. We'll go ahead and open it up to the public for any comments or concerns. Good morning.
Good morning. Excuse me. My name is Susie Vos, and I'm a senior project manager with the Real Estate Services Division with Public Works. And I'm here to thank Aaron and Cindy Gustafson and the CAP committee for recommending the Tahoe City Firehouse project to receive the Group 2 TOT funds. And I'd like to provide a very brief update, if I may.
Please.
We've received 6 proposals from feasibility consultants and determined that one firm really stands out in meeting our project needs. The name of that firm is Hunden Strategic Partners. Our intent is to bring a staff report forward to your board at the December 4th meeting to request delegated authority for Ken Graham to negotiate and execute a professional services agreement with Hunden Strategic Partners. We expect to have an executed agreement prior to the end of the year with findings to report back to your board at the April Tahoe meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Actually, Susie, I had a question for you, if I might.
Sorry.
On the firehouse study that we're talking about, that is going to analyze not just economic feasibility generally, but the 2 specific proposals that the community was very interested in trying to continue moving forward.
Correct. They're going to analyze both the proposals that we've received, one from Siren Arts and one from the Commonwealth. They're also going to look at what else might be out there. You know, what else is there for the highest and best use of that property that meets the needs of the community.
Okay, good. I just wanted to make sure those 2 particular proposals were going to be included as part of this proposal, because
Yes.
have heard very clear feedback from the community that they would love to see preferably both of those folks if they could figure out a way to combine their efforts.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Uh-huh.
Thank you, Supervisor Montgomery. Okay, now I'll open up to the public. Mr. Clark? Morning.
Good morning. I'm Bill Clark. I'm on the Squaw Valley Ski Museum Board, Foundation Board. I just want to thank the board for the continuing support over all these years and our efforts to bring this amazing Olympic and winter sports history to life. We're bound and determined it's going to happen eventually. In regard to this grant cycle and being put on hold, we're obviously disappointed. We've got a lot of momentum going when that grant was awarded. We immediately went out and quickly raised the matching funds with our donor base, which was extremely enthusiastic and willing to donate more money. I must admit, we don't quite understand the difference. The whole point of this grant cycle and what we proposed was to go through the EQ process to get to the point whether it would be a mitigated neg deck or an EIR. So in a sense, this puts us in kind of a catch-22 position. We need the grant funding to move forward, to finish the studies and everything that's required to get to that point to find out if there's an EIR. So far, in everything we've done, there's been nothing that would indicate that an EIR would be warranted. So we'll do whatever steps we need to, but it doesn't make a lot of sense to stall us in this project when we're trying to get to that point as it is right now. So I can answer any questions you all may have.
Supervisor Duran?
Yeah, I just have a comment. You know, I appreciate everything that you're doing and everything that you're saying. 2 things. The first thing is on the deed restriction. I'm not really concerned about that. I've done enough research on it, and I know that you've got a pretty sharp attorney on your
And
end.
County Council issued an opinion on that in March of 2017. It's very clear.
Right, so that's a smaller issue. But I think if you've looked at the history of projects in this particular area, any project, an EIR is your safest bet.
Right.
No matter what, you know, I know of the cost, but you've seen the things that we've had to move through here and how difficult it's been for the lift. You will be attacked, I guarantee it, if you do not do the highest level of evaluation on your project. Guaranteed.
Well, we need to get to that point, and we're not going to get to that point if we don't have the matching funds that we've raised to get to that point where staff can determine if it's an EIR or a mitigated neg deck. So kind of in a catch-22. So we're not sure where to go and we're not really even sure what the new application would look like since we're right in the middle of the process. So.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Okay. Supervisor Montgomery?
Yeah, I just wanted clarification. I mean, it sounds like what the CAP committee recommendation that's being brought forward and what Cedra is saying is that the process can continue to move forward to evaluate what level of environmental document you need, whether or not this grant happens now or next year. Am I misinterpreting that? I'm seeing no on
Well,
both
we need to
sides.
fund it, and so.
Aaron, can you address that?
Thank you. We actually have a current agreement with the Squaw Valley Ski Museum Foundation for $125,000 in TOT funds that your board awarded in 2017. Those funds have not been fully expended. It's for $125,000, $51,000 have been paid out. The scope of that contract is actually to complete the initial studies for the environmental questionnaire. So that contract was to complete that work. The new proposal that was submitted was to build off of that after the environmental questionnaire was completed. So the Museum Foundation does have additional TOT funds available to them by way of their current contract to complete that work as is outlined in the scope associated with that agreement.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
Thank you as well, because we weren't really clear if that first grant was, those funds were still available, because that was a specific period. So we have a lot of questions about the whole grant process that we need to study some more. So we'll come back to everybody concerned with a list of questions, issues, concerns on how we get through all this.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Clark.
All right, thanks.
Any other comments from public on this item? Seeing none, I'll close Robert.
Yeah, just a comment on this issue. So for me, and I think what I'm hearing from my colleagues is that it's not a question whether or not the museum project is something that everybody likes and is even enthusiastic about, but for the board, for me, the question is to what extent, if any, should public taxpayer funds be used on it? And that's not a small thing. So for me, I want to have my head around much more what the total cost of the project is and what the taxpayer participation should be, if anything. Obviously, we've indicated that we're willing to help at some level. But I also want to point out that this county has a strong commitment and long and unusually successful history of defending our environmental reviews so that we don't end up more than normally getting locked into these absurd fights where our environmental review challenges become a basis for negotiation on our projects. And that's much better policy, much better, stronger position for the board and for representation for our residents. And I'm not interested in compromising that position at all.
Thank you, Robert. All right, public comment is closed. We'll bring this back to board for action. There's two items. Item A1 is to approve Group 2 recommendations of the Capital Project Advisory Committee for Eastern Placer County for up to $547,774.
Move approval.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Hearing none. We will move to item 2, approve a budget revision for the allocation of transient occupancy tax funds in the total amount of $175,000 to Department of Public Works and Facilities for the Squaw Valley Park Winter Access and Enhancement Project. This is a roll call vote. Is there a motion?
Move approval.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Duran.
Yes.
Wygant.
Yes.
Euler. Montgomery.
Yes.
Holmes.
Yes. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you for your
Thank you very
presentation.
much.
We'll now move to our 10 o'clock timed item, Eastern Placer County Affordable Workforce Housing Fees. I'm going to turn this over to the Vice Chair for a minute.
Good morning, Shauna Purvines, Community Development Resources Agency. I was before you about 2 weeks ago talking about the Western Placer County Nexus-Based Affordable Workforce Housing Fee. And today we're bringing to you the Eastern Placer County Nexus-Based Affordable Housing Fee. Just by way of some background, both fees are based in the same methodology and the same focus. they are applied slightly different just because of the policies that govern those. Also, 2 weeks ago, we talked a little bit about how this relates to the overall work plan for the county. The fee is just one component of the Community Development Resources Agency's Affordable Housing Workforce Plan. It's also one component within the county's annual Housing Workforce Plan, which your board reviewed and approved on September 25th. I have here today both Jennifer Merchant, who's kind of overseeing the whole countywide housing unit, and Catherine Hansford, who was the one that prepared the fee. So the purpose of the study is to consider establishing an Eastern Placer County affordable housing fee that would be applied to the new market rate residential development as well as new commercial development. This is a little different, again, from the Western, which only addresses the residential development and is more of an inclusionary policy versus the employment policy we'll talk about here. The fee demonstrates the nexus between new development and the increase in demand for workforce housing. By way of a little bit background on this, in 2015, the Placer County contracted with Hansford Economic Consulting and Mintier Harnish Planning Consultant to provide the housing fee study. The study determined that maximum justifiable fee that could be adopted either as an impact or an in lieu fee. On August 8th of 2017, your board received a presentation on the Eastern Workforce Housing Fee as part of the annual Housing Work Program agenda item. And then earlier this year, we did ask that that fee study be updated to reflect more current cost information because the original analysis was based on the 2015. So this is now based on more current information. So the current general plan policies, these are found in the housing element that govern the fee on the eastern portion of the county, requires that new development provide workforce housing equal to at least 50% of the housing demand generated by the project. This can be achieved in four different ways, either by constructing on-site employee housing, constructing off-site employee housing, dedication of land for needed units, and/or payment of that in lieu fee. Also, any expansion of existing development. This, though, is the fee would only apply to the portion that's new, wouldn't apply to what's already built. The basis for the fee is development of the Eastern County fee for both new res and non-res lands is to address the needed workforce housing that's generated from that new development. The fee is a mitigation for the impact of the increased demand. It's calculated on the number of income qualified worker households generated by new development. And it uses a finance gap or subsidy methodology. So this is not a full cost of construction. And we did talk a little bit about that. Our jurisdiction, Roseville, tends to use that methodology. This one is based on the gap analysis. The purpose of the hearing today is to just obtain some board direction on establishing that Eastern Placer County fee. We're not asking for any action today. But based on previous board discussions on this item, the board generally directed that in lieu fees should be used as a last resort when proposed development can't otherwise provide that affordable housing. So the direction we're really looking for today is what did that last resort mean, and really what that fee level is going to be should you want to proceed with the adoption of a fee. So we did kind of outline in very general terms what some of the options are. One is that your board can direct that no fee be adopted as part of this effort. So if that is the case, staff will continue moving forward, negotiating affordable housing obligations with projects on a case-by-case basis. You can adopt a fee. And if you do adopt a fee, or wish to adopt a fee, we will want to discuss with you the fee level that you would like to address. As we mentioned, the analysis did a full, the fee analysis up to the maximum justifiable. So one of the options is to set it at that maximum justifiable. The numbers I have here, I won't read each one of those off, is that maximum justifiable based on that 2018 update. Another option is to set the fee at a lower percentage of that maximum justifiable. Some reasons to consider this may be that just for a financial feasibility need for projects, particularly up in the Tahoe area, and or just a desire to keep competitive with other regional markets. You could also set the fee that is based only on providing affordable rental housing and exclude a fee for the portion of ownership. That would reduce the fee a little bit that would be collected. And then presumably that fee would be used for the construction for rental projects and not be for ownership projects. Option 4 is an option today that staff is not recommending, but it is one that we wanted your board to consider, is you could establish a fee based on the full cost of providing that unit. Again, that's kind of the Roseville model that we talked about 2 weeks ago. Or you can adopt an impact fee for all land uses. This is probably more like a traffic impact fee where it is paid by all projects and everybody pays a portion of their fair share. So staff's recommendation, predicated based on some of the previous conversations we've had with your board, is that there be no fee option for those larger specific plan, area plans, or general plan amendment projects. We have found that these projects generally can construct their affordable units on site or have the means to be able to cause these units to be created. But do allow a workforce fee as an option for projects that are have an obligation equal or less than 5 units, or what we're calling smaller projects. We are recommending to set the affordable housing fee at the maximum justifiable amount for the residential, but we are suggesting that the non-residential fee be at a 50% of the maximum justifiable. We found that the non-residential has not appreciated at the same rate as the residential has. Plus, they have the added benefit of creating jobs and providing, in some cases, sales tax. And so we felt that this may be more competitive for the businesses in the Eastern Basin. Staff's also recommending your board consider some exemptions. This is not exclusive. There are other exemptions your board may want to consider. But for those projects that are coming in meeting other housing element or general plan objectives, such as creating medium or higher density residential, constructing 8 or more units per acre that result in a mix of housing types, development of infill sites is defined by the Public Resource Code, which is generally means that it's built on at least 2 or more sides, or development within a transit priority area, which is usually defined within about 1/2 mile of a major transit stop. These are suggestions for exemptions to the fee policy. 2 weeks ago, when we brought this item to you on the Western fee study, a question came up regarding, one of the public commenters brought a comment regarding the county's current RHNA allocations or regional housing needs allocation and what has been completed to date. That got us thinking kind of what are the other jurisdictions in our region and our greater region actually doing to meet their goals as well. So we just pulled these numbers quickly from the different jurisdictions in our greater region that submitted a 2017 housing report to the state. So it's straight off the state webpage. So you can see in the very low and low, the achievement of some of our other jurisdictions as well as Placer County is fairly low in the low and very low housing. You do have El Dorado County and Nevada County that are doing a bit better than most. And but I do want to caution you, this is not always an apples to apples. Each jurisdiction is generally within different regional planning areas, and then also based on size. It's important to note that it may be easier for some who have a lower RHNA allocation than others to meet their targets. Here's the moderate housing. Again, there are some that are still not quite achieving their goals. We're about 5 years into this housing cycle. It's an 8-year cycle. So some others, City of Roseville and Rockland, seem to be doing very well in meeting their moderate housing targets. And then above moderate housing, Most people are doing fairly well. These are kind of your market rate housing, with some actually almost 2 times the amount that they were estimated to need as part of their goal. So just some additional information based on the information we got last time. So conclusion and next steps, if your board does wish to proceed with the adoption of a fee, there's a couple of things staff still needs to do. We will need to prepare an ordinance that will regulate when and how that fee will be applied, and a resolution that approves the nexus study and establishes the fee and sets that initial amount of the fee and an ongoing escalator. With that, I will stop and see if you have any questions.
Any questions from board members? Supervisor Euler.
So, jumping back to the recommended fee level in option 3. Walk me through, if you would please, the application of these different fees, how we are making a determination, especially when we're saying in the first bullet that range of 21,000 up to 177,000 per market rate single family residential. How are we arriving at those numbers?
So with that, I might actually turn it over to Catherine Hansford. She can
Okay.
provide you some of that background in the study.
But if I may, just quickly.
Sure.
But this is, what is being proposed is this would apply to somebody who has a piece of property that is currently vacant and wants to just build a single-family residential unit?
That is not currently how the policies have been applied today. This would be on new
No, I
subdivisions
know,
or new
but
development.
that's, I'm sorry, new subdivision? It's not, okay, so
It would not be on an existing created parcel where just a unit has not been built today. That is not how we've been applying the policy.
Okay, so if we have an approved lot today and somebody comes to pull a permit for a single-family residential, so it would only be a subdivision, and by our definition, 5 lots or more created.
Or any new created lot, so it could be a parcel map. as well.
Parcel maps
Yeah,
are affected as well then.
correct.
So we're kind of blending the conversation between, I guess, the workforce housing conversation and the affordable housing conversation, because you prefaced your remarks by saying that what we're looking at in workforce housing is really directing the fee at those businesses, industries, if you will, that are creating a demand for a workforce. So that is separate and apart from what we're talking about here in option 3 under the affordable housing fee option, because I think it's a bit of a stretch to say that whereas somebody developing a hotel clearly has a workforce demand associated with that, somebody doing a parcel map, I don't know how we're creating a workforce demand by somebody doing a parcel map. So these are 2 separate things when you're having that conversation?
No, not
No.
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, so even the creation of a single-family home, not an existing parcel, but if you're creating new parcels, would still generate the need for employee housing based on the analysis that was completed.
So we're talking anywhere on the eastern slope of Placer County where anybody proposes a parcel map under option 3, we're looking at hanging an additional $21,000 up to $177,000 in fees on a new house that's being built.
That's how the policy has been applied, which is all new development shall mitigate up to 50% of its employee
But we're defining
housing.
that fee with this new fee schedule.
Correct.
Okay. All right. That's my only question.
Alrighty, any other questions from board members? Did Ms. Did Ms. Hanford, is that?
If she, yeah, if we did not answer yours. Okay.
Good morning, Catherine Hansford. The nexus is very similar. It's the same methodology as used in the Western Plaza fee study. So there is additional demand for workers that's created from both residential and non-residential. The residential nexus is based off of new homes being built, families moving into those homes, and the income that they spend then in the community on goods and services. That then generates the need for additional workers to provide those goods and services. So that's rather simplified, and it's a very complicated study. However, that's how the nexus works. New folks coming in, they spend the money, that generates the need for more workers. And then it does account for things like, are the new workers truly net new workers in the county? We do a discount to account for the fact there may be persons who are currently unemployed who take those jobs and things like that.
Supervisor Duran, did you have a comment, or?
Yeah, I did have a comment, and I'm a little bit concerned with that large chunk of change on a single family residence, because, you know, let's say, for instance, I build a business, rather than living in a tract home, I want to build a custom home. I'm not really displacing anything. As a matter of fact, I'm probably allowing another family to come into my old home and while I do my thing there. So I would be more inclined to deeply discount or remain the same on those single residential family units, whereas on a development scheme or development plan would do something different, because that would be, I think, would have more of an impact than a single family resident. So, but in any event, I think we need to do something. Kicking the can down the road doesn't behoove us. And if Roseville can do it, and believe me, I've been incredibly critical of the city of Roseville. I mean, just look at what's going on with their Measure B. But the one thing that they have done successfully is implemented their workforce and low-income and medium-income housing program, which is commendable.
Okay. Seeing no more board comments, now is the time for public comment on this item. Anyone wish to address this? Okay. Almost close.
Good morning, Chair Holmes, members of the board. My name is Pat Davison. I'm the Government Affairs Manager for the Contractors Association of Truckee Tahoe. I want to start off with big thanks for Shauna. She has the patience of a saint. The last 2 weeks we've had pretty regular communication. She's been sending me additional documentation. I've not had a chance to read that, but want you to be aware of the cheerful attitude and the gracious amount of time she's provided to our members to understand this. It is a very complicated study. We do have some questions about construction costs. The pro forma that was presented did raise some eyebrows, especially as we get to some conclusions about what happens with development fee increases. So we are requesting that some additional information be provided to back up or document one of the statements on page 27 of the study. Our greatest concern, however, would be for the small project exemption. I did want to talk a little bit about that. We do have some additional requests for information, different analysis, as well as some changes, and so I'll just preface this with, we think a continuation would help all concerned staff, our members, other members of the public, and you as decision makers to understand and move forward. Okay, so additional backup information regarding page 27 in the study. One request. The other requests are things like perhaps you don't want to have a blanket prohibition on accepting in lieu fees. A big chunk of change could be very helpful. $1 million in lieu fee at $50,000 per unit for down payment assistance could be 20 homes deed restricted for locals only housing. So I just offer that to you as a potential option in maintaining your flexibility as the county to accept in lieu fees. The other comment would be possibly looking at indexing the fee based on size, not sales price. And this is similar to how mitigation fees are being looked at. It's also ties into this idea of having scalable fees to incentivize smaller units. The next item is not using that 4.4% fee amount that you saw in the report, but something more like the 3.2% fee amount. One, it's dedicated to rental housing only, which we desperately need. Two, it's a smaller amount as we start this formal process to get into the fee program. You can reevaluate in a couple of years and decide whether something needs to be changed, but we would certainly encourage a smaller rate being used at the start of the program. Our most important request is that smaller project exemption, and that actually instead of allowing smaller projects to choose, do they want to pay the fee or build, that we exempt them. And what that magic number is, I think there's still more discussion. I'll throw out to you, the town uses less than 7 employees. So a line that we set in the program that says smaller projects, this number of employees is exempt. And we'd really like you to consider that as we go forward with the program. Researching the time of payment, it did cause our members a little bit of concern that some single-family homeowner, years after the subdivision's been approved, would be told that they have a $40,000 or $50,000 in lieu fee to pay. We're thinking it might be worthwhile to investigate what if the fee were paid at time of project approval, recordation of the parcel, or final map being some other option for time of fee payment. There would be no time delay, it's a development cost, and it avoids that unpleasant surprise years later. And then lastly, what exactly are we looking at in the magnitude of this program? Are we looking at lots of vacant parcels on the east side that will be affected and subject to the 50% requirement? Or is it really just redevelopment in those areas like Tahoe City and Kings Beach? And we don't have an answer to that, but we thought with some of the very sharp folks in your GIS department that a map could be created to show us what exactly is the extent of the issue. So that's it for specific requests. We did provide a letter to you with some other things. Staff's done a great job, and we do agree with several of the staff recommendations. 50% reduction in workforce requirement was wonderful, and thank Shauna from the bottom of our hearts for that. Thank you for recognizing and being sensitive to the needs of the business community. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you very much.
Any questions for Ms. Davidson from the board? I see none. Thank you, Pat. Good morning.
Good morning. John Falk. I'm the legislative advocate for the Tahoe Sierra Board of Realtors, and I thank you for this opportunity, and I do not envy the position you're in, given not only the housing crisis, but the apparent high wall that is being forced to be overcome to actually create new housing opportunities in the region. There are no easy answers. There are no great answers. What we would suggest is that you, once again, ensure that whatever you do doesn't actually serve as a disincentive to additional construction at any price point, because it's our opinion that creating new housing stock at any price point is good for the overall housing stock, because it does open up some of the older stock as people move up or out. And so we find that you want to encourage, incentivize in powerful ways those types of activities, rather than, for lack of a better word, punish those people that seek to create additional housing opportunities for rent or for sale. We also would ask that you be very sensitive to the fact that the for rental market is increasingly difficult in the region, and this is to say that there's a dearth of new for rent development proposals even out there, much less people swinging hammers. So with that said, understanding you want to create new for rental housing, anything you do that would propose to add a cost to rental housing might be a bridge too far, could be an impediment that's difficult to overcome. And so with that, we would just suggest that that if you do move forward with this, and it seems relatively reasonable given the options you had, in front of you and the reductions in fees, we would ask that you create a system, a suite of incentives that is equally as powerful and broad-based, so that parties could come in and tick off what they have to do to pay, and then tick off what they'd like to do to help increase their project in other ways that would offset these demands, so that you can soften the blow a bit. And with that, I welcome any questions you have, but I thank you.
Supervisor Duran?
Yeah, I do have a question I want to ask you. This is something that just occurred to me. Let's say, for instance, how would you feel, if you think that there isn't a disincentive, but how would you feel if a developer front-loaded their, the fee remains the same if a developer were to front-load their obligation as opposed to building it over time, and then at the end of the road, the longer they wait, the more they're going to pay for it?
Yeah, I mean, and this is, just off the cuff, but from hearing that, my thinking is that if that would create an incentive for people to do it early. And so you could use that, you could call that an incentive. If you're going to have the requirement, if you have some mitigating factor for doing it earlier, then that would be, I think, a nice offset, as long as the back end for people to do it over time doesn't become so overly burdensome that it's really not a choice.
Well, I think the goal, I'm still trying to figure out, and I don't mean this rhetorically, I'm still trying to figure out what the harm is in raising the fee when you have an obligation. Mm-hmm. And it would seem to me that it would behoove you to get that obligation taken care of as opposed to just paying a fee. And I think the fee has been, for whatever reason, our negotiation has kind of put us in, behind the 8 ball here. But it seems to me that, a developer, with the cost of money, the longer that they wait on to do something, we all know prices are going to escalate. So it would behoove them to do that early. So at least they've got that done. Yeah. So anyway, thank you for your.
Good point. Holding costs are a real issue, but having the available funds up front to actually comply and utilize that are also at issue.
And that's something I think we can talk about in using the Treasury. I know our own Treasury can do a lot of things to help with this as an investment, not an investment, but as a means of assisting folks to get that done.
That'd be appreciated.
If that's the goal, to have housing put in now,
right,
as opposed to waiting for 30 years.
Yeah, no, that's compelling. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comment? Mr. Tuma, good morning.
Good morning. Samir Tuma with Kilo Properties. Thank you for the opportunity to talk on this item. I want to focus on the multifamily residential component here and some food for thought on a couple of things. One is, as the gentleman just said, rental housing, if it's multifamily, is extremely tough to build in the community. And so loading, whether it's a fee or even an obligation onto a rental housing community, creates an additional barrier they may want to think about. And also in the multifamily, having a flat fee or a flat number is also something, as was mentioned before. I really think you should think about scaling the fees, because the trend is to try to build housing that's achievable by design, and achievable by design typically means a much smaller unit. So if you're building a housing unit for, let's say, $150,000, and you're loading almost 10% on that, that's going to be an impediment. One of the things that I wanted to ask for some clarification on, and maybe to give some thought as we move forward, is whether this obligation, whether it's through building a unit or through the fees, would apply to the achievable housing that we've been talking about. And I know that you haven't gotten there all the way in terms of defining achievable housing, and it seems to me that these fees or obligation don't apply to affordable housing. They do apply to market rate housing, but that missing middle, that achievable housing, would these fees apply, or the obligation apply to that type of housing? And that may not be an answerable question at this point, because you haven't defined what achievable housing is. But as you move forward, if you put this sort of obligation on the achievable housing type of communities, you're sort of putting it in one pocket and then taking it out of the other in terms of incentives to make it work, yet charging the fees or the obligation, where what we're really trying to produce there is housing for people who live in the community, who work in the community. We're trying to come up with incentives and ways to do that. So I want to be careful about loading additional obligations onto those types of developments when and if they come forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Truman. Anyone else from the public wish to address the board on this issue? Seeing none, I'll bring it back to the board. Kirk.
When we were looking at the fee over on the western slope, we were looking solely at residential. We didn't have a component in there for non-residential uses. And the fee that we were looking at was substantially lower than what's being proposed here on the residential. Fair?
Fair.
Okay. So I'm looking at what the real cost is that we are saying on the eastern slope to meet our affordable housing or achievable housing goals if we have a fee that is substantially higher on the one segment that we identified on the western slope, and then we have the additional fees which apply to every other land use which we didn't include on the western slope. It seems to me we're saying the cost to provide the kind of housing that we're hoping to provide is 3 to 5 times on the eastern slope what it is on the western slope. Is that?
Yeah, and Catherine can correct me if I'm wrong, but this, the cost of construction and the cost of that housing, creating the housing, is higher on eastern side. And wages. In addition, we're also seeing the wages lower because it's a more service industry, so that gap is bigger. Right. And this was the gap analysis, so that's why we're seeing that.
And folks recognize that one of the reasons that we have an impediment to providing more affordable housing on the eastern slope is the additional time and cost associated with development on the eastern slope. And we just had a presentation earlier today where TRPA, in recognition of that additional time and cost, is taking steps to hopefully provide a little more certainty earlier on in the process for people and help drive down that time. And yet here we are conversely looking at substantially increasing the cost associated with developing. I'm once again in this very awkward position of trying to figure out how making things more expensive in the housing market in general creates affordability in general until we've looked at what are the market drivers that we do have some kind of control over to provide incentives to people to get product in the ground. And I'm not convinced that we as a county have explored what are those incentives that are available beyond us simply collecting a fee and then hopefully having some dollars that would be available to somebody at some point in the future who might also be subject to this fee to come in and build something. You know, the market tells us if you want to reduce the cost of something, flood the zone, right? You want to reduce the cost of anything, make more of it. And yet we're increasing the cost to make more of it. And so I really struggle with this fee-first approach that we're taking to address affordable housing, be it on the western slope or on the eastern slope. And I will again say, until we have figured out as a government what are all of the tools available to us to drive down the cost to provide product in the marketplace, I don't want to be looking at what makes it more expensive for some people. I don't believe you will provide housing to some people by making it more expensive for others. I don't think that's the right approach.
Thank you, Supervisor Euler. Supervisor Montgomery?
Shauna and everyone who spoke today, thank you for your comments. John, to your point, we don't actually have to make a decision today, so we're not under too much pressure, thank goodness. I'm gonna reiterate what I said the last time we talked about this on the west side and what I've said very publicly, which is what we have done so far is not working. The idea of collecting fees and hoping that we gather enough over time to build appropriate amounts of workforce and achievable housing hasn't panned out. And I think kind of our ad hoc approach that we've had up here to, negotiating each development individually doesn't make a lot of sense. I'm a big fan of the Roseville model, which says, hey, development community, you want to build a big new subdivision, you need to build your workforce housing associated with it. It needs to be part of your project, needs to be part of your process, and it needs to be rolled into that whole analysis. So my suggestions today are that, certainly, Shauna, on these larger projects, we say, yeah, no fee. We don't negotiate a fee with you. We tell you got to go out and you got to build your employee housing associated with this. And I share Kirk's concerns around attaching this to an individual, someone who just comes in, buys a lot, and wants to build a home, and it's been recently subdivided from a larger lot to, a single family. So I'd love to sit down with you and maybe have some more conversations about that offline. I don't think today is the right time to have that conversation, but I do want to have that conversation. I think for the smaller projects, and we've discussed this before, I think a fee could potentially be appropriate in there, but my suggestion again is that we limit the options. So right now we have a number of options, including you give us land, you give us a fee, you build off-site, you build on-site. I'd like to narrow those options and just say, you either build it yourself, whether that's on-site or off-site, and I personally prefer on-site. I live in a community of very mixed values of homes, and we all live together beautifully. But I think we should not be taking land donations. We should not, as a county, be the one moving these developments forward in the future. It's more expensive when we do it as a government. It's much more effective when private development does these kinds of projects. And, frankly, it's just, we have enough battles we have to fight that the idea that we need to go out and try to, as a county, find partners to build on county property or with county dollars just doesn't make any sense to me. Let's figure out how to get to a smoother, more direct path to this. So I think those are my only thoughts on this today. I think there's definitely some room for some additional conversations, but I'd like to see much more of the Roseville model implemented both here on the east side and the west side. I'd like to have continuing conversations about what does it mean for sort of the single family individual trying to build a single custom built home. I think conversations around that smaller project, I think the proposal that you have right now, which is there is a fee potentially for that, but I'd also like to encourage them to build within that project. And then last but not least, just slipped my mind, but it will come back to me and I'll circle back with you and let you know what it is when it springs back into my brain. Thank you.
Thank you. Supervisor Wygant.
So in my mind, I think I'm trying to bridge the gap between the comments of my last two colleagues. So in a broad sense, I want to first thank staff again for the recommendations in and of themselves. That must have been an interesting conversation you had with your colleagues. But it was supposed to be an interpretation of what the board has been saying for the last couple of years now, and I think you did well with it. I'm, in both cases, west and east side, leaning towards those at a pretty strong angle, I guess. And so, the question for us, if you're of a market economic ilk, which I would definitely put myself in the category, you can make the argument of why should government do anything? But by definition, local government is in the business of trying to provide mechanisms for the healthiest communities possible. And in that includes, in my view, planning for land use that includes a mix of residential types, in my opinion, dispersed throughout a plan area, whatever that definition happens to be. So I really like enforcement of our inclusionary requirements, and I really oppose, I want to have staff provided with discretion to negotiate intelligently, particularly in light of a myriad of incentives that might be available. And as an aside or an add-on to that thought, but you have in the past brought forward, I think the board's discussion over the last several years have been to do that sum of all of everything. And I think we've said over the years, we didn't really exclude any particular policy recommendation that's been brought for us, but it might be good to just kind of bring forward those lists on these discussions as we go forward to remind us all actually of everything that we are trying to do in terms of incentives as well as requirements. So the kind of thing that I don't want, though, to give you some specific definition, is there's a project that I'll leave nameless at this point in time, but there was a 4-1 vote on it, and I lost. But it, in my opinion, as a result of staff discretion, really was completely relieved of its affordable housing component compared to the project that had been approved beforehand, as well as a bunch of other things which caused my no vote. I don't want staff to have that discretion. I want at least those things that have to come back to the board or be brought to our attention before it gets to that point where we're looking at a total package without the ability to look at some of the details more thoroughly. So the inclusionary component, I think, is the answer. I get also that up here, the numbers are bigger as a result of the cost of construction and the distance in the gap. And I like the consistency of the methodology in both places, and in fact, that consistency is reflecting the difference in the challenges. So, you know, if you're a free market person, you think about things like, you know, we could just add lanes to the freeway between here and Reno, and that would be a market basis, I guess, by which you could say that that Reno market its market could absorb that. But there's public cost to that. So you can't completely crack that nut of letting everything just go with market mechanisms. So as a foolish offer on my part, I'm willing to get down into the weeds more on the numbers and the methodologies. You know, I kind of actually like that work to an extent. It will take some time, but I think particularly up here, it might be that the board has to go through a little bit of that before we can really get a comfort level of the myriad of tools that we want to put in place. But again, for me, is where I started. In both instances, the east and west side, I like staff's recommendation. Really like the fact that you were willing to do it, and I'm leaning strongly in that direction, with the devil being in the details.
Thank you. Supervisor Montgomery, did you have an additional comment?
Yeah, I actually remembered the final point I wanted to make, which is sort of following up on Supervisor Duran's comments about kind of incentivizing early construction rather than later construction. I would like to see where we do put the requirement on the development community to actually construct. We make sure that gets in the early phases of the project rather than in the later phases. There are a couple projects up here in the east end of the county that had some housing obligations associated with them that just never got constructed because they never got to phase 3. And I don't think that was our intent, but I want to make sure that, you know, whatever the impacts of the development, they do get addressed earlier in the process of development rather than later. So that was my third piece. Thank you.
All right, any more comments from board members? Well, I see that there's plenty of, I agree with just about, well, parts of everything that's been said. But it looks like we have to do a little bit more work to come back to give some proper direction. Do you have direction now that you can go forward with?
I do. Just a quick summation of it, just to make sure if I missed anything. So I do appreciate your feedback, and this is a tough nut to crack for sure. The numbers are big, and I think we understand why they're big now. What staff can bring back to you is both as part of the same item, conversation of the kind of the whole tool chest, and the incentives that may be able to go along with an ordinance. It does sound as if we are moving towards a possible adoption of some type of an in lieu fee or fee for employee housing and affordable housing. And then we maybe can refine those fees. We'll work with some of the commenters here and maybe bring back some suggestions of the various levels. But it does sound like that there is some interest in looking at some different levels of those fees as well.
Okay.
Did I capture it all?
Supervisor Montgomery?
You did. I just want to make sure that I know this is actually going to be coming back on November 6th about the west side to our board. And one of the things that I requested for that presentation, I'm going to request for kind of any updates on this as we move forward, which is also an understanding of the magnitude of, what kind of properties could this even apply to in these areas. There is a perception that somehow this is some kind of silver bullet that is going to solve the housing crisis. And I think it's really important that we communicate very clearly, both to the development community, but also to the public more at large, that this is actually a fairly narrowly tailored conversation, both here on the east side, probably even more so here on the east side than on the west side.
Actually, I guess it just depends on how you look at that. But because on the east side, it's all new development, essentially, that it applies to. So the magnitude could be bigger or just touch more. But maybe the size of the projects are smaller. On the western, it's only general plan amendments that increase residential density or specific plans. So the number of projects that the county receives on those is very small. As a matter of fact, since 2013 and these projects coming in, there's only been 6 of those. So it doesn't touch as many, but it may have a bigger magnitude because those projects are bigger.
Right. I'm just thinking more largely about the geography rather than the potential number of individual projects. We are pretty constrained by geography up here.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
You got your work to do. So should I go to this one now, the supplemental item? Okay, the board will now take up the item on our supplemental agenda, 5.1, Administrative Services, update on transit occupancy tax ordinance. Oh, here we go. Good morning, gentlemen. And lady. Got one lady.
Good morning, Chairman Holmes, members of the board. Jerry Gammas, Director of Administrative Services, and with me is Doug Jastro, our Revenue Services Division Manager, and Jennifer Merchant, our Deputy CEO for the Lake Tahoe area. The item before you today is being presented as an update on the proposed amendments to the county's transient occupancy tax ordinance and to obtain any direction from your board based on today's discussion. The intent is to introduce the ordinance at a future board meeting in November. So again, the item is just to have a discussion, seek board direction, and not any type of approval from the board. We left the clicker there. Oh, take a short break here.
Assuming it works.
Technology. Sorry. The topics we plan on reviewing today include an overview of the TOT program, a TOT ordinance background, some of the TOT ordinance update drivers, stakeholder outreach and feedback, talk a little bit about the revised amendments and staff recommendations, and as I stated earlier, is seek some board direction on where we would want to go with some of the proposed recommendations. The Administrative Services Department's Revenue Service Division is responsible for the administration of the county's TOT program in accordance with California Revenue and Taxation Code 7280A and Placer County Code Article 4.16. The California Revenue Taxation Code basically allows any legislative body of any city or county or city and county to levy a tax on the privilege of occupying a room or rooms or other living space in a hotel, inn, tourist home, or house, motel for lodging for any period of 30 days or less. Just wanted to share that. The overview itself, just always like to share this here. The Revenue Services, as I stated, manages these accounts. There are 4,000, I'm sorry, no, these are total. Nope, I went too far. It is. The Revenue Services Division manages 4,706 active accounts. These are broken down as follows. About 3,106 are in the eastern slope with management companies. There are 69 total management companies managing these accounts here. 1,483 are also in the eastern slope without management companies, and these are generally more of your short-term rental type properties. And then about 117 on the western slope. So the TOT rate for Placer County as a whole is 8%, with an additional 2% being collected within the North Lake Tahoe transient occupancy area as approved by the voters. The numbers here, TOT collections by fiscal year by the Revenue Service Division, and it's being collected and remitted by our operators for fiscal year 2017-18. Was $18,509,817, and for fiscal year 2016-17 was $17,670,778, which accounts for about a 4.7 increase over that previous year. But the increases here that are noted on this slide are not necessarily attributed to increases in stays, but rather the short-term rental compliance initiatives that we began 2 years ago as approved by your board. You may recall we issued a contract with Host Compliance to seek some of the short-term rental properties that were being operating here in the county and not in compliance with the ordinance. So the amounts that we show up here reflect those efforts. As you might recall, also your board approved us once we identified a property to go back one entire calendar year for the revenues that were due. And so that's why these amounts also are included in these totals. TOT paid by visitors helps fund initiatives that benefit the county as a whole, including public safety, transportation, libraries, public parks, infrastructure improvements, and historical and environmental preservation projects, as you heard some earlier today. TOT Ordinance 485B was first approved by your Board of Supervisors in 1964. So we've been doing this for a while. One would argue that these were simpler times with regards to lodging. Since that time, the ordinance has undergone approximately 30 updates, with most being approved by your board, with the most recent one approved by your board in May of 2013. As a tax administrator and the Director of Administrative Services, our expertise lies within the administration of the TOT ordinance as it relates to the management of the TOT certificates and the collection and remittance of TOT. We rely on our lodging partners to ensure charges within the industry are periodically identified, or changes within the industry are periodically identified. But from a personal perspective, as a customer and guest, we've had the opportunity to travel and stay in many overnight lodging facilities throughout the years. We've currently seen a change in marketing strategies from a single jingle of back in the days where we'll leave the light on, to free parking, in-room air conditioning, free HBO, flat screen TVs in every room, complimentary breakfasts, et cetera, et cetera. These are all marketing schemes to get folks to stay in their hotels that were competing for the business. These were offered in an attempt again to increase these stays. However, in 2007, we made a change in our ordinance because we noticed a shift in our Lake Tahoe operators and the fact that we were more of a preferred vacation destination. It was in 2007 that we introduced special packages language for the first time in the county's ordinance. Our most recent audit of 24 operators concluded in December of 2016, and as with prior updates, the Administrative Service Department, in collaboration with the Auditor Controller's Office, the County Executive Office, and County Council began to identify updates to address the most current audit findings. As previously stated, the county's TOT ordinance is periodically updated. The drivers behind these updates include addressing audit findings, changes in the industry, streamlining operations and functions pertaining to the administration of the TOT program, and community and operator input. This slide here represents a summary of the general audit findings for this last one that concluded for calendar year 2014. As an example, TOT on all room-related fees was not collected, TOT was not separately stated from rent, and so forth. I won't read through all of these, but certainly there was 9 common themes amongst the number of operators that we audited for calendar year 2014. Based on the drivers mentioned, the categories addressed included the addition of a few new definitions, including guest receipts and managing agent, revisions to the definition of rent to further address the special package requirements, further define the roles and responsibilities of the tax administrator. We're providing clarity on current requirement of TOT certificates per unique parcel number. We're introducing a good neighbor fact sheet, new local contact information requirement to address short-term rental concerns, and a recommendation to transition the appeal approval process to an independent hearing officer who is not a county employee, and the inclusion of additional enforcement language to assist with the collection initiatives. Our stakeholder outreach began with internal department staff first, and as I previously mentioned, followed by an operator feedback with multiple forums, including the distribution of the draft ordinance to all our operators in September 7th, a presentation on October 1st to the North Lake Tahoe Resort Association Board, and a community meeting with our lodging operators on October 11th here in Tahoe City. In addition, we identified changes that were received from some of the public and community members as a result of the short-term rentals. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Doug Jastro, who actually facilitated a lot of the community meetings, and he would be better prepared to explain kind of what happened during those community meetings and some of the feedback we received and some of the recommendations that were brought forward.
Good morning, Doug Jastro, Revenue Services Manager, and I was in attendance at the outreach meetings with operators, and what we've done here is that we've highlighted 5 of the primary areas of the feedback that we received. First, mandatory and room-related charges was discussed quite a bit. Guest receipts, that includes both special packages and itemizing TOT amounts separately on those guest receipts. Also, posting of the TOT certificate, both on-premise and in advertisements. Clarification for requiring TOT certificates by unique parcel number or APN, and a transition from hearing appeal approval process from the Board of Supervisors to an independent hearing officer. So with the feedback that we received, we did come across some changes that we made based on that feedback. So Placer County notified all registered operators of the requirement of the inclusion of mandatory and room-related charges back in 2007. This practice is consistent with other jurisdictions and accounts for a significant amount of tax. Operators expressed concerns with the definition being too vague and too difficult to ensure compliance with the ordinance. While staff recommends no changes to the definition, we do recommend the implementation of additional measures to ensure operator compliance. These measures include an annual training or outreach meeting with operators and property managers, a quarterly newsletter that would be distributed to certificate holders, the development of an operator handbook to address operator concerns that would be distributed in both hard copy form to all stakeholders and also online. And these measures are also just in addition to the frequently asked questions section that can be found on the county's website. This recommended code language and clarification of the intended interpretation is consistent with TOT codes in similar tourist-based jurisdictions. Next, the elimination of the requirement of itemized packages within guest receipts. The requirement to list rent and tax separately on all guest receipts dates back to the original adoption of TOT Ordinance 685B in December of 1964. In June of 2007, Placer County amended the TOT ordinance extending the itemization of a rent and tax being listed separately on all receipts and books of record for special packages. Notification of this requirement was made available to all operators via U.S. mail back in 2007, and this requirement serves as a starting point for any audit to ensure the tax collected from transients and remitted by the operators in compliance with the TOT ordinance. Operators expressed concerns about this requirement, stating that it conflicts with their agreements with business partners that prevent the operator from disclosing the cost of special packages provided to guests. Staff has proposed language that would partially address the concerns raised by the operators by eliminating the need to itemize special packages while still maintaining an adequate audit trail. The requirement to separately itemize the tax, as well as other assessments, is consistent with state law for the disclosure of any tax and remains the staff recommendation. This practice is also consistent with other jurisdiction ordinances. And finally, the requirement to list the TOT certificate number on premise and in all advertisements, including in online platform listings. This was based on feedback received from operators, this inclusion, and the practice is common with other jurisdictions, especially those with a high percentage of short-term rentals. In order to ensure compliance with the ordinance by all properties and to simplify and streamline the audit process, feedback from hotel properties addressed a concern about posting on all advertisements, much of which is destination-oriented and in each room when the certificate is already posted in conspicuous common area locations. The final staff proposal is a compromise that eliminates the requirement for all TOT certificate holders that possess a business license. This addresses issues posed by hotels and property management companies and now only applies to individual short-term rental properties that do not possess a business license. Two recommendations that did receive opposition that I'd like to highlight here, and we did not reach an agreement on these two items, and we are seeking some direction from the board, from your board today. This includes that the current requirement of having a TOT certificate for each hotel, which is owned separately or has a separate APN. The language was added for this requirement back in the 2013 TOT ordinance amendment. Some operators remain who have not interpreted the language from that ordinance to mean that each operator shall have a separate TOT certificate. The most recent audit revealed that some operators are not in compliance with this provision. At least one property management company currently manages dozens of separate properties under a single certificate. The recommended language revision intends to clarify the language interpretation that each property with a separate assessor's parcel number shall possess an individual TOT certificate. This interpretation and subsequent clarification is consistent with TOT ordinances across the state of California. And the second item relates to the transitioning of the appeals process to an independent hearing officer whose decision would be final. Prior to 2013, the Board of Supervisors heard TOT appeals, which included hearing witness testimony and the introduction of written evidence, and then the board issued a final decision. The ordinance was changed in 2013 to amend this hearing process. Currently, the county executive officer hears the matter, including witness testimony and written evidence, and at the conclusion of the hearing issues findings and recommendations that go to the Board of Supervisors for consideration and a final decision. While this change alleviated the participation of your board in lengthy hearing proceedings, recent appeals have called into question whether the current process works efficiently. The board is being asked to render a decision on an appeal without having the benefit of being able to directly assess the credibility of witnesses or examine the actual evidence introduced at hearing. staff recommends that the process be amended such that the appeal be heard by an independent, third-party, neutral hearing officer that would have a background in law, accounting, or auditing. The decision of that hearing officer would be final and binding on both the county and the operator. A small number of operators have expressed their preference to have the appeal remain with the Board of Supervisors. This next slide is basically represents how Placer County aligns with similar destination locations within the state of California, and staff's recommendation to continue the requirement of the collection of TOT on mandatory and room-related charges on the first line there, the requirement to separately itemize TOT charges on guest receipts, the requirement of a TOT certificate per parcel number, and the appeals process delegated to an independent hearing officer. Some additional changes made in response to our feedback sessions over the past several months include requiring certificate holders read and acknowledge understanding of existing county ordinances regarding noise, trash, parking during their initial registration process, and also to follow up on that, requiring the posting of a good neighbor fact sheet for vacation rentals. And third, requiring local contact information be on file with the tax administrator's office. This slide here shows an example of the good neighbor fact sheet that we're hoping to include in the registration process, and also require that it is posted on the premises. There's also a copy of that available on the county's website, and we have hard copies here available upon request. And with that, we have our next steps. We're hoping that from this point forward to provide additional opportunity for public input. Also, specifically here today to obtain board direction. And our goal is to introduce a revised ordinance for approval in November of 2018. This concludes our presentation, and we're happy to answer any questions at this time and to welcome your board's direction.
Thank you for the presentation. Supervisor Duran, you have a comment?
Yeah, a couple of things. Is this ordinance, is it your goal to also be applicable to like Airbnb and those kinds of things?
Yes, sir, it is.
I would recommend that you make it clearer. For example, when you look at tourist home or house, you know, it doesn't say that, but I would include those terms in there, and also in your definition of operator, because it's lacking there. The only way that you get there is by looking at what a hotel is. And even though a hotel says a tourist home, it still doesn't use an example of Airbnb. And you want to be as clear as possible, because I can imagine people and lawyers looking at this thing for any loophole to get out of it. So if that's your intent, I would, those would be very good changes. The other thing is that what is our goal here? I mean, is our goal, you know, to put people out of business, or is it to get compliance?
Absolutely not to put people out of business. It's actually to ensure that they're in compliance, and quite honestly, to even the playing field. I believe that everybody benefits from the benefit of TOT across the board. So if we were able to even the playing field.
And I appreciate hearing that, because in our last issue dealing with this in Granelbachen, and maybe I'm using the Granelbachen's owner's position, but he kind of felt like he was dealing with the IRS, and I don't think that's what our job is. You know, from an administrative standpoint, it's to get compliance and to get them in compliance any way we can. And you know, one of the things that I've always talked about, and since this is my last meeting in Tahoe, I'm going to talk about it again, is that you know, I don't know what we give them to do this stuff. And, you know, some people probably do it on an Excel spreadsheet. Some people do it on this, and some people do it on that. But I think it would behoove us to spend the money and get a uniform system to where they can log in and do their TOT in one form. you know, and then if they do that in one form, then we can give them some type of presumption that if they do it this way, we're going to presume that it's correct. So your odds of being audited are going to be somewhat lower. Because it seems to me that our biggest problem is number one, interpreting what they put or how they, you know, collect and document what tax goes where, whether it's a phone call, whether it's a meal, whether it's, you know, the use of a crib or whatever. So, you know, whatever we can do to make it easier for the user to, you know, document their input, I think it's better off for us, because then we can look at their data, and if they haven't, you know, or if they're trying to do something funny, we'll know it right off the bat. So I think that's something that, you know, we should make an investment in, you know, in the future. And the final thing is I guess I don't understand why we're creating a new process when we already have a tax appeals board that the county assessor uses, and why we're not just kicking these over to the tax appeals board, because it seems to me that we're probably going to have fewer of these appeals, and rather than going to the expense of creating another board or another appeal process, that we would just, why wouldn't we just kick it over to them? I mean, all 5 of us have made appointments to that appeals board, so, you know, it's folks that we trust, it's folks that have an interest in doing the job of tax appeals, and from what I've heard, it's a pretty good system. And why we're not using that, I don't know. So, sorry about the length, but.
No, your comments are welcome.
Supervisor Giller.
I'm not clear on what you're actually recommending in terms of the packages and how tax will be demonstrated on the packages, and what you're recommending in terms of how a package would have to be itemized. So what is staff's recommendation at this point?
So prior to today's recommendation, the ordinance required for those special packages to be itemized, otherwise they would be considered rent and taxable. What we're recommending is a compromise where special packages would not have to be itemized, but the tax, the TOT tax, would have to be listed separately, so that then when we would get into an audit scenario, we could look at the tax that was collected from the guest on that guest receipt and match it up against their book of records to ensure that the amount collected was the amount remitted for TOT tax. Again, we're not looking at, actually we do not want to hamper or harm our operators from being able to market special packages, understand and respect the agreements that they've made with their business partners. So what we are recommending is a compromise to not have the special packages itemized, but simply to ensure and continue with listing the tax separately as originally, as it's been there since 1964.
Okay, so just to be clear, when Supervisor Holmes books the romance package, then he's gonna see on his bill $1 amount, but the tax will be based on what the provider says is the cost of the room. So the room was $100. His total bill is $150. He's going to have $10 in TOT tax, and that will be called out separately. But that's the only thing that'll be called out separately.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. And then to the issue of removing the board from the appeal process, I'm not necessarily in favor of the board being removed as the final arbiter. I don't disagree that it might be an interesting experiment to introduce this non-county third party as a step before we get to the board, but I think ultimately folks need to have that right to appeal to the Board of Supervisors.
Understood, thank you.
So Kirk, you're saying that instead of having it be in the final, the administrator review be the final arbitrator, the appellant would still have the opportunity to appeal to the board?
That's what What I'm saying is I don't want to eliminate the board as the final appeal opportunity for a taxpayer, but I think it might be interesting for the board to have the benefit of an appeal having gone through an independent third party. So it's kind of combining where we are now with what the recommendation was. Does council have some kind of concern about that?
No,
Okay.
no concern. Just want to clarify, right now, the way the ordinance is written, that it's heard by the CEO, it comes on recommendation to the board, and I think the concern is that recommendation doesn't give the board the entire ability to look at witnesses, cross-examine, et cetera. So if I understand what you're saying is one possibility, which is certainly something could be added to the ordinance, is that either the CEO reaches a final decision or you employ an independent third-party hearing officer to render a final decision with an appeal to the board, which allows the de novo hearing.
I agree, and I would actually take that step of the appeal to the CEO out, and I would substitute that with so your total number of steps remains roughly equivalent, but we do add that independent body into the process that then is appealable to our Board of Supervisors.
Okay.
But not necessarily mandatory, correct? So if the operator and the county both agreed to the hearing officer's recommendations, it's not mandatory that it come to the board?
Oh, no, of course not.
Okay,
No.
just want to get clarity on that.
Fewer items, the better, yes, absolutely.
If I can just comment, Kirk, on what you're saying, I get it, but what I don't want is, I still want the CEO to be able to negotiate these things and get them off the table, even if they're in the process of going to an appeal.
I agree, Jack. I think that's very important, and I think that CEO can still be involved in the process of negotiating prior to it going to an independent body. I just like the idea of removing the CEO, because clearly from the taxpayer standpoint, I've been battling with the county, and now you're telling me the head of the county is the guy I got to sit in front of? What? How's that work?
I get you, but I think there's a lot of value to have the CEO.
No doubt.
Even if they get past, let's say, for instance, they go to independent folks, and then there should be an opportunity to engage them at any time.
Sure, absolutely, I
to
agree.
dispense with this.
I agree, absolutely.
And the first phase, as it stands now, is the county executive officer. The second phase would be the hearing appeal officer, and then, as Supervisor Euler had mentioned, if we don't reach an agreement, would go to the Board of Supervisors. So there's certainly levels there for it to be resolved prior to even coming to this level.
All right. Supervisor Montgomery.
Yeah, thank you all so far for your comments on this. I agree with what seems to have just been worked out around the process. I think it's important that the CEO have the latitude to have conversations to try to reach some sort of settlement. If that is not successful, then move to this third-party kind of independent, I'm going to say mediator. And I think we've only had 2 appeals in the 10 years I've been on the board. One was under the previous iteration of this process, and one was under the current iteration. What I would suggest to address the concerns around, maybe the board not getting the whole context is perhaps we videotape the independent third-party piece so that we can review it, so we actually can see the specific questions and answers, can see the arguments that people made. So that, I think, would address the concerns that we may not understand the sort of intricacies of the conversations. We would have that opportunity to do that, and any future board would as well. So I would suggest we make that part of the process. Couple comments that I had on this is one of the things that I would like to see is, while there are definitely pieces of this that get specifically to the sort of online rental platforms, I would like to, maybe not under the TOT ordinance, but at some point in the future, come back with some additional codification of rules and regulations around how those do operate. I think requiring them all to have TOT certificates is critically important. I would like to see a posting on the exterior of the building that says it's a short-term rental and how to contact the property manager of that. And I know that there's been some concern about that, but I can just tell you that if you drive around our neighborhoods now, you will see signs all over properties that they're managed by such and such a management agency. And I don't see a huge distinction around those two things. And the reason I think that's important is because we do get concerns from folks that, you know, these people, maybe they've read the good neighbor policy and, you know, how to be a good renter, and they're just not engaging appropriately. We want neighbors to be able to immediately reach out to the responsible party in the community to say, hey, there's a problem with this particular rental at this particular place, and you need to come solve it. I'm concerned, it appears that our recommendation is that we would require local contact information to be on file with the tax administrator's office to address nuisance reports. I don't see how that resolves issues immediately. And the concern is immediate. You know, it's people partying, it's people with giant fires, it's people lighting off fireworks, it's people parking all over the street when they're not supposed to be in the street. We need to figure out a way as part of this TOT ordinance, and I think we can, to make sure that those behaviors are addressed. And then again, in the tips for being a good neighbor piece, this is really small and I can't read it and my eyes aren't good enough quite to see that either. But I want to make sure that we not only look at our own codes and regulations, but we make sure that, you know, when the fire department has a ban burn in effect, these renters need to understand that that means they can't have a fire. You know, that's not our regulation, but they need to understand that they are subject to all independent special districts regulations as part of being a renter in our community. And I think honestly, if we could get those two pieces, some kind of exterior notification so that we can reach out to someone immediately if there is a problem, but also create a context so people don't create problems for their neighbors. And I say this as someone who has a number of second homeowners in my neighborhood who rent out short-term, where there are some of these problems. I think that will really help us resolve a lot of the concerns around these short-term rentals. And I think off the short-term rental conversation, I think it's very important that we did, frankly, say if you have a business license, you don't have to, you know, list your TOT certificate because that's part of your business license. Strongly in favor of making sure that each APN has its own TOT certificate. They're free. We don't charge for them. It's not an extra cost, but frankly, it creates some clarity for the individual property owner as to, is it my property that was being rented or is it my neighbor's property? Particularly when you're in a condo-style association and you're being operated by a management company. Resort at Squaw Creek has done this for years. They have individual TOT certificates. I don't think that's a bridge too far for us to be asking folks to participate in. So those are my comments on that.
Thank you, and you are correct. Short-term rental, we'll be happy to come back and have another discussion with regards to the database being with the tax administrator's office. That would be made available to law enforcement. We are having a requirement that they're within 50 miles of the short-term rental facility. The Good Neighbor policy brochure does have the contact information for law enforcement and so forth. Again, we more are focused on the collection and the administration of the tax and not necessarily the enforcement piece, but trying to assist to make some good progress there. That, like I said, the database would be made available. We have had discussions about some signage perhaps being put on the homes. Would have to work again through Department of Public or Community Development to make sure it doesn't violate any of our signed ordinances and things of that nature, but we'll be happy to have that discussion. And real quickly to Supervisor Duran's point, coming in the very, very near future, I would say at the beginning of the calendar year, we will have, we will be introducing an online payment system so that rather than having all these forms faxed, mailed, you know, snail mail, US mail, the operator can go right online, remit their worksheet and payment and be done. The majority of our appeals that we have on a quarterly basis are because an operator mailed a check and not the worksheet, or mailed the worksheet but not the check, and so forth. So this will just allow them to do it online and get a confirmation from us immediately that we've received it. So we should see, we're planning on seeing a decrease in those appeals.
Yeah, just as a suggestion, I would, you know, maybe for a year, you know, allow them to get used to that system, and then after that I would make it mandatory, so you get 100% the folks using that system, so.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Jerry, thank you for the comments on the, how the tax administrator's office might be participating with PCSO. My concern is, while that information might be on the Good Neighbor sheet, it's not necessarily the actual neighbor of the good neighbor who would have that information, hence the idea about some kind of signage outside, so that if there is a problem, the second homeowner or the permanent resident can say, okay, there is a problem, who do I reach out to? I think it's really important that, yeah, and hopefully it should be the sheriff's department. We should make sure that they're on board with that. But we've just really got to be able to address the community's concerns, which are legitimate in many cases, about bad behavior that people engage in, whether they've been encouraged to be good neighbors or not.
Understood.
Thank you.
Thank you. Supervisor Weigand.
The only addition I would make is focused on the independent hearing officer notion. So I just add for consideration, maybe staff could drill down into, I get the argument that some constituent may want access at the end of the day to the board, and I'm kind of torn on what's more efficient but open. So I find Jack's notion kind of provocative as relates to Assessment Appeals Board, who of course specifically is dealing with property tax issues. If you're going to hire this third-party person for this kind of expertise, maybe that expertise would have to be provided to them, because property taxes are a different animal than TOT tax. But so if the layers are the same, one, the county exec's office has the authority to try to find resolution in a disputed audit. But the audited party feels that they want to appeal that. An assessment appeals board that has that independent expertise in TOT tax might be a good step. And with that, if they wanted to finally come to the board, I think the specific legal request or requirement would though have to be an appeal by them to get here, because I think that would help minimize more frivolous appeals that people may choose for a range of different reasons that I won't delineate.
Thank you. I think it would be the better part of wisdom to check with the county assessor before we move forward on that item. So now I will open it up to the public. Is there anyone from the public who wishes to address us? Good morning again.
Good morning. John Falk, Legislative Advocate, Tahoe Sierra Board of Realtors. First, I wanted to build off of what Supervisor Euler brought up, and I would wholeheartedly concur that the idea of an independent appeals board or appeal officer is attractive, it's strong, it makes sense, but the final arbiter for any dispute should be the elected officials that run the county, the ultimate decision makers. So I would ask that you do have that type of approach. And I would also agree with Supervisor Weigand suggesting that there be a stepwise approach, that you can't leapfrog and go right to you and burden this group with hearing the minutiae, the particulars of a case, but ensuring that they go through the steps, that they do have ultimate ability to appeal to y'all. I would also ask that, and I understand that Supervisor Montgomery's brought this up in the past, I've spoken to her about it, that having signage on the outside of a home, a structure, is a two-edged sword. It's not all bad. Obviously, some people do it now as a marketing tool. But it also, if it's mandated, there are a number of people that choose not to have that type of signage in or around their home, outside of their home, because it does identify to all that it is an STR. And people that rent STRs, short-term rentals, actually oftentimes do so because they want that local experience. They don't want to be set apart from, but be a part of the local community. And calling it out as an STR could be problematic. And then those with more nefarious objectives would know that this home is not occupied very often. And so you're also giving a beacon to say, if you're interested in break-in, this might be a more attractive option. And so I'm not suggesting that it be out of hand rejected, but I am suggesting that perhaps it be optional. And for the individual who doesn't feel that it would be prudent to have a sign on the outside of their home, then perhaps they would be given the opportunity to communicate with neighbors in a given surrounding concentric circle, saying that, you know, we're going to STR this home on occasion. We have a property manager that will respond to your questions, queries, concerns in a very, you know, quick fashion, and their number is this, their name is this, and that anytime it changes, we will inform you. So that way, people still have the ability to access the individual who's supposed to be in charge of making sure they comply with the good neighbor provisions, and that they are indeed a good neighbor. And finally, the whole idea of having a good neighbor pamphlet, fact sheet, whatever you want to call it, is outstanding, because a lot of the things that are done that end up being the major complaints about STRs are done through ignorance, not through any real objective of doing so. So having that type of good neighbor policy is outstanding. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm John Burnham. I've owned a vacation home on Dip Street in Brockway since 1972. This area has always been a quiet retreat and a pleasure to be at. That is until recently. I represent a minimum of 10 neighboring households on Yacht, Speedboat, Harbor, and Dip Streets in Brockway. I'm here to address the Airbnb crisis in our area, as well as in Placer County. I'm also here to address your good neighbor policy contained in this transient occupancy tax, though it seems to be on a sort of small scale compared to the financial part of it. I'd like you to look at the human element and what Airbnbs have done to people that live there. 3 minutes is not enough to scratch the surface of the issues I ask you to so I ask you to review a letter which I sent by email to the board on August 3rd of this year to get more detail. Over the past few years, the invasion of Airbnbs into my neighborhood has wreaked havoc with the previously peaceful retreat environment we enjoyed. Airbnbs have brought recurrent loud and sometimes drunken parties, renters parking on private property and in no parking zones, renters' garbage placed in my neighbors and my cans, belligerent renter responses when asked to quiet down, multiple calls to sheriff's assistance to deal with drunk and rowdy renters, renters shooting off illegal fireworks under low tree branches at the height of the drought, hot tub parties with up to 12 people in a 6-person tub, basically in my front yard, unresponsive rental agencies. Speaking of rental agencies, my experience has been poor with them, including registered letters, including direct calls, including trying to get a direct person that is 24/7 available for response. That has been very poor. This does not, and problems include stresses on our aged infrastructure. My neighborhood was developed in the 20s and 30s, and our sewer system was put in the 70s, as well as depletion of available long-term rental housing, which you have identified as a crucial concern for Placer County. I purchased my cabin in a single-family residential zone, but I am basically now living in a commercial zone with 3 mini motels on my 6-house block. Each of these houses accommodates 10 to 13 strangers at a time, and these strangers change every 2 to 5 days in high seasons. The renters pay big money to be here and expect to do as they please. They have no buy-in to the neighborhood values or character. They feel entitled. As you are all aware, I am not a lone voice crying wolf about this Airbnb crisis. This is a national and international problem. which has spawned consulting groups such as host compliance, with which Placer County now works, as well as strict regulations and penalties for Airbnbs and renters and owners for abuses. If you pass a good neighbor policy, I and my neighbors ask and request that this have teeth, that there be associated penalties and fines for abuses. If it's just a piece of paper and it's just posted on the wall, it does not serve its purpose and does not protect those of us that want peace and quiet in our neighborhood. We also ask that commercial businesses such as these mini motels be restricted to commercially zoned areas, not residential neighborhoods, where the mixture leads to tension and animosity due to conflicting purposes, making money versus having a peaceful retreat. We ask you to restore our peaceful retreat at Lake Tahoe. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Good morning again.
Good morning, Samir Tuma, this time with the NLTRA hat on. First, I'd like to thank Jerry and his staff for the meetings and discussions we've had. I think the ordinance has come a long way, and there's a fair amount of the comments that have been incorporated. However, there are some sticky issues that are left to be resolved, and so I would like to request that between now and the time it's brought back to the board, that a small working group be formed to work with Jerry and his team, including perhaps some outside hotel expertise, because there are still several more nuanced issues that are presenting some challenges, I think, for the industry. With respect to the appeals process, I'm very glad to hear the direction it sounds like the board is going to go in. I think the hearing officer is a good step. I would like to request that the hearing officer, and it's my understanding it's going to be on a rotating basis, that hearing officer have specific hotel industry expertise. There was discussion around what could be someone with accounting background or someone with legal background, but our industry has and is changing very, very rapidly, particularly with respect to some of the things like how packages are presented or how some of the marketing is done. So I think that's having that expertise as part of the hearing officer is important. I really like the idea of Supervisor Montgomery with respect to televising that. I think that would, if there are issues, that would certainly help to understand things like credibility or how evidence was introduced. But I think it's extremely important that ultimately the decision lie with the elected officials. Those are the only people that we as the community have recourse with respect to, and so that ultimate decision really needs to remain with the board. Thank you.
Thank you.
Samir, before you leave, I'm not suggesting it be televised. I'm suggesting we record it and that there's a link to it.
I
don't think anyone's going to want to watch it live in real life.
I misspoke. Only some of us are addicts to this sort of stuff, but the recording, and you can look through that and flip through it, very helpful.
Yeah,
So.
and then could you just, I think for the benefit of the board, could you maybe expand a little bit upon what you think these particular areas are that still need to be addressed?
There were some discussions around how there's definitions that are in the ordinance, but there's still some ambiguity, I think, with respect to exactly what's in and what's out, if you will, in terms of what's taxable and what's not. And so for example, there was discussion around having a handbook that would be delivered, and I think having some discussions around what would go in that handbook would be very, very helpful. But there are also processes for understanding how the language would be interpreted, and I think that's where a lot of the vagueness still remains, that have been expressed by members of the lodging community.
Yeah, and I understand that concern. I will just caution you that it's very difficult to create anything that says everything that falls within column A, but not column B, because there's always column C, which is unknown at this point. There may be some completely new thing that comes forward, and I think that's the intent behind having some latitude and the ability to say, okay, we didn't think about, whirly gigs. Now, whirly gigs are going to be clearly defined as not being subject to TOT. So I think it's very difficult to make something prescriptive. Am I getting that terminology right, Karen? So I think while there's certainly some value in having conversation about that to get as much clarity as humanly possible, there is never going to be a bright line with black, white that lists everything conceivable.
Sure. No, I
Okay.
understand and appreciate that. I mean, I think we're very well aware of that. If I think back 2-3 years ago, what was going on in our industry and how we operate, we would interact with wholesalers or third parties, that changes all the time. That said, from the discussions that we had, for example, there's a question about what is room related. Mandatory versus non-mandatory is a little bit easier to understand, but what is room related? And there was discussion in the room, and different people had different points of view about what's room related. So I would encourage that you have sort of a column A, column B, and a column C. And column A maybe is what's in, column B is what's out, and column C is this bucket that remains out there that says we may interpret as things come up, they may be interpreted differently. And I think that they referred to having sort of an annual discussion with the lodging community and updates to these things if new product or new questionable areas come online. But to the extent that we have things that are known that may be a difference of opinion, whatever the decision is, we will comply with that, but we just want to know. I want to know whether pet fees are in or not. I want to know whether cribs are in or not. And if they are, that's fine. Just list them out so we have that list.
And I think that is the intention of what staff is proposing here today. Am I just completely misunderstanding that?
You are understanding it correctly. So with the manual or handbook, whatever you want to call it, as well as what would be listed on the website, we would be defining those things that it doesn't make sense to define them in the ordinance because the world is changing. So we can get in there on a quarterly or a monthly basis and define that, and then reach out to the lodging operators and let them know, hey, we've made a new definition here. This is included in the room related. This is not included in room related. In fact, that is exactly what the town of Mammoth Lakes does. Very similar region, very similar situation with packages and the tourism economy. So we're proposing to do that, get that information out to the operators, get it on our website so they can check it on a regular basis. And of course, if there's a question about it, that's when somebody would bring it up to us. Is this in bucket C? Well, we're going to have to interpret that. So we don't have a gray area bucket, because then we get ourselves into trouble. It's either in or it's not in. And then when that comes to us, we'd be clarifying that and putting it on the website. And that's what is proposed in the ordinance right now. I think we could go back once we come up with that list and reach out to the lodging operators that we've met with so far to review that list and get agreement on it. But I think it will be really the interpretation of the administrative services director on what's in and what's out. The main concern we heard was, do they know what's in, what's out, so that they can follow the law? Because that is first and foremost what they've stated they want to do. So they know what's included, then they can do that with their business.
Yeah, and on that conversation piece specifically, I would suggest that we not only, I'm going to use the word passively, although it's not passive, that we not only passively post it on our website, but we proactively email as these things get updated. We have a list of all our lodging providers. I'm assuming we have a way to get a hold of them. And, rather than waiting for them to go check out the website to see what changes we may or may not have made, I suggest that we actively email to those folks at the same time we're updating the website, so that there's not a question and somebody doesn't say, oh, well, sorry, I didn't go check the website and whirly gigs are now part of the room rate.
Yes, that is the plan.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for that, Jennifer, because I think that's exactly what I think we would, as a lodging community, we would like to be involved in that initial setup. And we may disagree. Ultimately, it's the county's decision. But I think through that process, we would come to understand and have a lot more clarity. And my understanding of some of the previous appeals and some of the questions was just that there wasn't clarity on it. So getting that clarity and being part of that process, I think, will be helpful in defining the list, but also getting the buy-in of the lodging operators as well. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the board. Cindy Gustafson, CEO, North Lake Tahoe Resort Association. I wanted to join Samir in thanking staff, Doug and Jerry, as well as Aaron and Jennifer, who did a lot of outreach with us to make sure we informed our TOT collectors and operators, our business community members, of several of the meetings and the opportunity to provide input into this ordinance. And I think we've come a long way. The discussion today has been very helpful. I think it's addressed a number of the concerns. And those interpretations that we were just talking about, Jennifer, I think go both ways. Often it's the industry who's going to hear or see something new that comes on from an online operator or a wholesaler, and they're going to say, wait a minute, this is a nuance that you don't know about yet, Jerry and Doug, and so we need to get this into the discussion. So it's really a two-way street. And we really appreciate the progress in that discussion about making sure that there's an annual meeting, that we go through those interpretations, because what I heard, and I know you heard this too, all of the people that attended said, we want to be in compliance. We do not want to have a public document with our name of our business in violation of the county. We want to collect this TOT. We want to do it fairly, and we just want to be really clear on what it is. And it's these nuanced items that are really probably the minority of charges anymore. I mean, I think the big ones have been addressed, but the nuance of we're collecting almost over 18 million, but in our area, just about 18 million. They want to be part of that because that money is going into real solutions in our community to address problems for the industry. And so they're willing to participate. Our board of directors, I've got, I think, 8 or 9 TOT collectors on my 17-member board. They're willing to be a subcommittee or a working group to kind of facilitate this discussion. So we just offer that if you need to bounce some ideas off those. Those are the largest. Most of those are in the top 20 of your TOT collectors in the region. So thank you again, and thanks to staff for all their outreach.
Thank you, Cindy.
All right. Do we have any more comments? Excellent. Do we have any more comments, thoughts for the board, final thoughts? I guess not. Okay, great. Well, then I guess we'll go ahead. We got an update. We'll go ahead and move on to.
Did they get what they needed?
Yeah, did you get
Do you
everything
guys want
that
to
you need?
summarize what we heard? So we.
Actually, maybe if I could step in the one area where I'm hearing a little bit of consensus, but maybe we can wrap it into something to provide direction to staff is on the appeal process. One thought I had, and it was partly Supervisor Wygant bringing up the AAB. The AAB is actually a creature of state statute, has very specific rules on appeals. I don't know if they could hear something like TOT. We'd really have to look into that. I can tell you there's a practical issue right now with the amount of appeals going to the AAB and even finding people to sit on the current AAB. So there are concerns about that. That being said, one thing you might want to consider is something that is very akin to what the AAB process goes through. And that is you have your initial appeal, for example, to the Revenue Services Tax Administrator. The purpose would be to see if a consensus could come up similar to a stipulation which the assessor staff performs on a regular basis when there is a dispute over the tax. So you could have the initial, and it would be an appeal, initial appeal go to the tax administrator, determine if a consensus could be reached on a different level of TOT. If not, and I'm just throwing this out, and if not, then the original TOT determination stands. That individual then could have a separate appeal to either the CEO or an independent third-party hearing officer. Or you could establish, for example, a 3-member appeal body, although I have to warn you, finding people to sit on those is incredibly difficult. I think that's why staff went to the independent hearing officer, where you have a revolving list of qualified hearing officers that you can tap into. So that would be your second point of appeal. At the end of that appeal, there could be the third party, the appeal to the Board of Supervisors, in which the record of the prior appeal could be brought forward, including a transcript and all the information as your record to look at as you then take on the appeal as an appeal de novo. So that's one suggestion of what I kind of heard from everybody as to what might be board direction. But I'll leave it at that. It's just some thoughts I had listening to this.
Would council, would that packet include a bench brief?
It could. It certainly could.
Because I think that would be most helpful as opposed to everybody going through miles of documents, and at least to outline the specific issues and where you can find the testimony on the transcript.
That's a really good idea, and in fact, the AEB is going towards that kind of model as well, as having it briefed and bringing the briefs to the board.
Thank you.
Supervisor Euler.
Yeah, I don't want to create too many layers in this, and I think there is definitely an advantage to getting an independent third party involved in the conversation. If a taxpayer or a tax, I should say, collector and remitter, which is actually what they are, if a tax collector and remitter and the county are at odds and cannot come up with something, I would just as soon see that first step be straight into that independent third party, and then from there, whatever that independent third party says it should be, the tax collector and remitter ultimately has the ability to appeal it to our board directly. So you're really just talking about the county and the tax collector get together, work it out, hopefully. If not, go to the third party. If the tax collector remitter still feels he didn't get his day in court, comes to us, we make the decision, we're done. As far as establishing a separate board for that, stepping into the Wayback Machine, when I first served back in the early 90s, our board was the Assessment Appeals Board for property tax hearings. And it was actually Supervisor Wygant's predecessor who made the recommendation that, and yes, believe it or not, Supervisor Wygant did have a predecessor. He wasn't the guy who has been here since the county was established, Robert. So Alex Ferreira, actually largely in reaction to the passage of Measure A that limited supervisor salaries in 1992, Alex Ferreira recommended a number of different committee and commission restructurings. And the creation of the Assessment Appeals Board was really done in reaction to the board kind of taking on that part-time status. And so I'm fine with our board sitting in this capacity, but I think it's very simple. Either the county and a tax collector remitter get together and have an agreement, or they don't, they go to a third party, and then that can be appealed to us and we're done.
Supervisor Duran, your light is on.
Oh, the final comment was, and this goes way back to Jen's original comment about signage, is that if signage doesn't work, then we can use some of that TOT money to put up a website that identifies on a map where these houses are. That's a website that's accessible to anybody, and then you can also post your notices or, you know, good neighbor policy, whatever. Complaints, what have you. So that's it.
Okay. Any other comments? Seeing none, it seems that the board has given pretty direct. What is that?
We've got copies of the good neighbor policy for folks who want it.
Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So now, at long last, we'll meet to item 7, Public Works and Facilities, an update on an RT Nahas property acquisition 3205 and 3225 North Lake Boulevard, Tahoe City, and request for proposals. Who is bringing this forward? Is that you? Yeah. That one lady?
That lady. Yes, good morning, afternoon.
It's afternoon, you just hit it.
Just hit it, okay. Jennifer Merchant back here on providing your board with an update on the Nahas property acquisition. I figured while we are in Tahoe, I'd let you know where we are on this process. So we will start with the action requested, really just to receive an update. Want to talk to you a little bit about the purchase and sale agreement, the request for proposals, and funding for the property acquisition. So the goals for this project include responding to a regional need for achievable housing, and under that includes impacts on the tourism economy as well as local government and other businesses that serve that economy, and the ability to provide visitor services and amenities. Also create a mix of housing to serve a range of housing needs and income levels. The location of the property, just about 2 miles east of Tahoe City on Dollar Hill, adjacent to the location where you had the ribbon cutting yesterday for the bike trail. It's 3 parcels of vacant land, 11.4 acres, and it is the site of a previously TRPA and Placer County approved mixed-use housing project, which was really kind of the chief reason that we were led to this property, because it had been approved already for a potentially similar project. So on the purchase and sale agreement that was approved by your board on August 28th for a purchase price of $3.6 million, it was executed 2 days later. And we are in the investigation period, and we're undertaking specific tasks related to that right now. Public Works and Facilities is working right now on the Phase 1 environmental assessment that's being formed. And the county's approval of condition of title is due on November 5th, so we're working with the seller on that as well. And just as a reminder, the initial investigation period ends on February 26, 2019. And we've currently got a refundable deposit in right now. If we determine after February 26th that we want to continue an escrow on the property, we can extend up to 3 3-month extensions, and those will cause that refundable deposit to go hard and be non-refundable, and then each $20,000 deposit is also non-refundable. Oops, press the wrong button. The investigation period activities, other than the Phase 1, we are continuing to work on determining project feasibility, which did include sending out a request for proposals to potential affordable housing developers who may be interested in that site. I'll talk a little bit about that later. Identifying the funds to purchase the property, as well as approve any entitlements or notices or studies or reports and condition of the property. So the request for proposals that was distributed was released on September 4th. We did have a pre-proposal meeting in the Tahoe City Cedar office on the 14th. I think we counted 16 or 17 qualified developers at that meeting, so we are pleased at the turnout. The proposals were due on October 12th, and we received 4 of them. So very pleased with the response on the RFP. We are planning to hold interviews with the developers on November 16th, and we hope to get back to your board with an update and possible action by the end of the calendar year. I believe your last board meeting is on December 16th, 18th, in that range. Anyway, by the last meeting of the year, we hope to get back to you with some recommendations. I do want to hit again on community outreach, because that has been a pretty robust part of the process that we've undertaken so far. We had a public meeting on August 1st, received a lot of feedback on the concept of developing on that site. All of that feedback was folded into the RFP so that anybody proposing on the project was walking down that path knowing what the community desires were, et cetera, for that site. We reviewed the project concept with NITRAC and the idea that your board was interested in potentially engaging in purchasing the property and making it available for development. We provided a secondary update on the 12th, and I will be back, and this date is wrong. It's actually November 8th. I don't know how I came up with the 14th, but I did. So we'll be back to NITRAC with just a very brief update during public comment. So just to review the next steps on the purchase and sale agreement, we're looking to identify an additional $1 million. That's a gap we've got right now in the actual purchase, and hope to receive board direction before the 26th on the purchase and sale agreement. On the request for proposals, we will be evaluating those responses that we received. We do have a 7-member team reviewing, a panel reviewing the proposals. There are 3 local residents and people engaged in housing on that panel, plus myself as a local resident and a representative of the county reviewing that. And we will be back to your board, as I said, to make a recommendation. And we will continue to undertake community outreach as well. Happy to answer any questions.
Any questions from board members? Supervisor Montgomery.
Jennifer, thank you for the update. I know that we were really kind of operating under some fairly significant time constraints around here. Do we feel like we're meeting those milestones so far?
Yes, we do. We pushed the interview dates for the developers as close as we could get them done before the holidays. So that's why we selected that November 16th date. We believe that will give us some time to understand the project proposal and at least go to your board before the end of the year, if not with a specific selection and agreement, at least a conversation about the criteria and how the developers have ranked and give you an idea of where we're leaning, if not ready to make a decision on an actual agreement at that time. But I think certainly before the 26th, we would be ready to do that. I think what we will not be ready to do is to have an approved project by then. So that would be too soon. So we know that there will be some level of risk that the board may be required to, asked to, desire to take in knowing whether we have a project that could be approved before we put hard money down. So I think there is certainly some risk there. I think the more information we get, and once we review the project proposals, we'll have a better idea of how much risk that really may be. And if it's too much, certainly staff wouldn't be recommending moving forward. And then on the funding side, that's another area where I think we've got risk. Currently, I'll be meeting with a nonprofit board that does have some money available for housing in November, and I hope to make an ask there and at least come up with an agreement where they would be able to set aside funding if we did decide to buy the property and move forward with a housing project. So that's what I'm working on right now.
Excellent. Thank you.
Any other comments from board members? Seeing none, is there anyone in the audience who wishes to address the board on this issue? Seeing none, thank you for the update.
Thank you very much.
And now we'll move to item 7B, Transportation Coordination and Corridor Planning, Lake Tahoe Bi-State Region Memorandum of Understanding. Mr. Peter Kratz.
Good morning. Good afternoon, Chairman, members of the board. Peter Kratz with Public Works and Facilities. So I'm overdressed today with a tie, but I'm going with the theme of yesterday. Yeah. This is a bike tie too. It's got bike chains on it, if you can't tell. But
oh, good.
With that, the department is very excited about this item before you. It represents a concerted effort going back 18 months to align Tahoe Basin agencies in order to compete better for major transportation funding opportunities in the basin. This effort resulted in the development of the Lake Tahoe Bi-State Region Memorandum of Understanding that is before you today for consideration. As you can see in the board memo and the MOU, this effort originated with realization that the Tahoe Basin has a $3 billion funding need for bringing transportation infrastructure to a level that can better handle residents and visitors moving in and around the basin. There is increased congestion just through a growing population that needs to be addressed in a more efficient or strategic way, and the MOU highlights the steps to reduce that congestion. The MOU truly represents a collaborative effort through formation of a bi-state consultation on transportation committee that resulted in 17 agencies being asked to sign on, representing federal, state, and local organizations, and work together to tackle the funding gap and deliver projects more efficiently related to transportation and in recreation as well. Through my involvement on the committee, I've tried to not focus so much on the large funding gap that has been identified, but rather on the things Placer County has already been doing to move the needle through improved transportation infrastructure, whether that's our TARP systems plan to increase bus frequency, or multimodal projects like the Kings Beach Commercial Core Improvement Project and the Dollar Creek Trail we just opened. These are good examples of providing alternative modes of non-auto mobility. Another good example from the private side is the micromass transit system recently formed in Olympic and Alpine Meadows that addresses what we call that first mile and last mile so that TART can focus on the mainline service. In quantitative terms, the MOU can be distilled down to 3 objectives that I really like in this document that we want to accomplish in the basin over the next 10 years. Number 1, double transit ridership. Number 2, build another 23 miles of bike and pedestrian paths, similar to the Dollar Creek Trail that we put into service yesterday. And number 3, deploy new technologies that put real-time travel options and information for residents and travelers, so they're more informed on traveling and what's going on out there. And these 3 things really look to and should reduce congestion over time. Real quick on transit ridership, just to put numbers to that. So if you combine TART and the South Shore service, right now, at least for last year, 1.25 million riders occurred over an annual or over a 1-year period. So we want to move the needle to 2.5 million riders in the next 10 years. So it's a lofty goal, but those are the things that will reduce congestion in the basin over time. Finally, a little bit on the positives that I see out of this experience. The 3 biggest positives that I see with this MOU execution include the following. Number 1, it organizes federal, state, and local agencies and their transportation plans under one guidance document. So when competitive funding is pursued at a state or federal level, the basin is more successful in landing those funds. Number 2, it coordinates our funding initiatives basin-wide so we are not duplicating or overwhelming constituents with too many asks. Examples of this in Placer County relate to the issue of potentially considering a TOT increase in the future, along with a sales tax consideration with recent passage of Assembly Bill 2920 that allows increases to the time and amount of sales tax in the North Lake Tahoe area, along with development of a transportation plan that identifies what the sales tax would pay for. These are 2 very important revenue initiative examples that other agencies in the basin need to be aware of so that if regional revenue initiatives are considered, there's coordination with how constituents are educated and surveyed. For example, a regional revenue evaluation for transportation funding was just launched by the Tahoe Transportation District that will examine a plethora of funding options and interact with both state legislatures. This could include things like a basin entrance fee, and obviously we want to tread lightly and strategically plan on how funding proposals have the most potential for success. And finally, the third big item out of this MOU that I see is important is organize our efforts basin-wide for implementing challenging projects and programs like paid parking and park and ride facilities. We talk a lot about it over time. Tourist destination area like the basin, parking's all over the map. Some places it's still free, some places it's still paid. It varies a lot. We want to get into more of a world of demand parking districts. These things they're challenging. Town of Truckee went through it a couple of years ago. It was very challenging to get there, but these are the kind of revenue sources I think we really need to get to over time to deal with transportation challenges in the basin. And then finally, just want to recognize a couple of folks here that still might be here. I know Cindy Gustafson with the North Lake Tahoe Resort Association. She was on the committee along with Samir Tuma, representing the private side. And of course, Samir's coming in on private issues is very important to have on a committee like this. And then, of course, Cindy's leadership is with the North Lake Tahoe Resort Association. My alternate was Jennifer Merchant with CEO, and so I interacted with her a lot on developing this, being involved with this MOU and coming forward with you today on this, and she supported me, so I thank her for that. And so with that overall summary, I'll conclude my remarks and bring it back to you and ask for that you authorize the CEO to execute this MOU. Thanks for your time and attention.
Thank you, Mr. Kratz. Supervisor Duran.
Yeah, I'm one of those insomniacs that appreciates reading these things, and I noticed that it wasn't attached to the document. But if I can get our county council to say that their office has read it, and I'll defer to them and I'll read it later. So.
Right, and I'll say that oftentimes we put thicker documents, we file them with the clerk of the board, and so I apologize for it not being an attachment.
Well, you won't have to worry about that very much longer.
Okay,
So.
okay.
Any other comments from board members? Anybody in the audience wish to address the board? Really, Cindy? No? Okay, you're good? All right.
It's all good.
Just to respond to Supervisor Duran's question, yes, we have reviewed it.
Good, thank you. So I'll bring it back to the board for action.
I move that we authorize the county executive officer or his designee to execute a memorandum of understanding for comprehensive transportation coordination and corridor planning for the Lake Tahoe Bi-State region.
Thank you for not making me read that. It's been moved and seconded to approve the item to authorize the county executive officer. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Hearing none. Thank you, Mr. Kratz, and thank you for your nice tie.
Thank you again.
Next one is successor agency.
And now we will adjourn as the Placer County Board of Supervisors and convene as the Placer County Successor Agency. And this comes forward with Eric and Jennifer. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Eric Finley with the Department of Public Works and Facilities Real Estate Services Division, and I'm happy to address the Successor Agency Board regarding our Eastern Gateway property sale. County staff is assisting the Successor Agency with the disposition of the Kings Beach properties. Our action today is to request your authorization for the Director of Public Works and Facilities as Successor Agency designee to negotiate a purchase and sale agreement with Kings Beach Center LLC for the purchase of the Eastern Gateway property consisting of 10 vacant parcels, 1.3 acres at the intersection of North Lake Boulevard and Chipmunk in Kings Beach. The purchase price would be $1.1 million. And we'd ask you to direct the staff to return to your board with a purchase and sale agreement for your consideration. Kings Beach Center LLC should be a familiar name, and I'm going to return to them in a few moments in this presentation. There are 4 Kings Beach properties associated with the former redevelopment agency. The largest in orange is the Kings Beach Center, which is currently county owned. And then the other 3 properties, the purple is the Town Center South, the yellow is Swiss Mart, and the larger green is the Eastern Gateway property, which is the subject of our discussion. The disposition of these properties was put forth in the long-range property management plan that was approved by the Successor Agency Board, the Oversight Board to the Successor Agency, as well as the Department of Finance in 2014. And it addressed the disposition of the properties in a vision that was associated with the redevelopment agency's plan for the properties, as well as consistent with community plans and the area plans. Staff working with the Successor Agency made efforts to dispose of these properties in 2015, 16, and 17 by a variety of measures. We did a process with the procurement services to release the properties through a request for information or a bid request. We also posted the properties as available on the properties themselves. We listed them with commercial property listing website. We also advertised during the RFP or RFI process and bid with local and national newspapers, including the Wall Street Journal. And we also entertained some unsolicited offers for both Swiss Mart and Town Center South. The Eastern Gateway property in this process never received any offers through the RFI process or through unsolicited offers, and it's the property we're discussing today. In September, in September of 2018, we received a letter of interest from Kings Beach Center LLC to acquire the Eastern Gateway property. Kings Beach Center LLC is currently under contract with the county or Placer County for the purchase of the Kings Beach Center property, which is the larger 3.5 acre property. So it's a mouthful to talk about the two properties and the buyer. I'm going to say the buyer from now on when I'm referring to Kings Beach Center LLC. The buyer is currently under contract with the county for the Kings Beach Center and wishes to pursue a contract for the Eastern Gateway property. With the development of the Kings Beach Center, or the proposed development, as was discussed earlier with your board, there may or will be a workforce component required for their development. They're proposing to do hotel, commercial space, condominiums, as well as some public space. And so it's anticipated that there's going to be a workforce requirement or workforce housing requirement for their project. Anticipating that there won't be room on site, the buyer is looking to fulfill that housing obligation with the Eastern Gateway property and acquiring that property to do that. So this is a concept that was prepared many years ago by the redevelopment agency for a layout of an exact use that the buyer is proposing, where there was ground floor commercial, about 10,000 square feet, and then 2 floors of residential. So the buyer is proposing to acquire the Eastern Gateway property and do commercial on the ground floor. And then they're hoping, and it's still preliminary, but hoping to do 45 residential units on 2 floors above that would provide up to 90 beds of workforce housing that may be required for the Eastern Gateway, the Kings Beach Center, but also that would also generate excess workforce housing. So it would be a larger project than they would need. They would fulfill their requirement and then have excess workforce housing. The purchase price they're proposing, again, is $1.1 million. There would be a $25,000 initial deposit at execution of the purchase and sale agreement, and then a second deposit after they clear their property contingencies of $25,000, and the deposits would become non-refundable after the first year. There would be 2 contingency periods. The 60-day property contingency period would be for environmental, geotechnical site investigation title, and then there would be a project approval contingency period of 1 year to work on addressing commodities for the properties, the environmental review, and project approvals. And there would be the availability of a 1-year extension to that project approval contingency. So this project is tied in with the Kings Beach Center development, and so there would also be a contingency where the Kings Beach Center project approvals would need to be obtained as part of this completing the closure of this purchase and sale agreement or closure of escrow on this site. So the 2 projects would be tied together as far as contracts. And again, I want to be clear, the contract for the Kings Beach Center is with Placer County. The contract for the Eastern Gateway property is with the successor agency. The last material term of substance is this excess workforce housing. So the buyer hopes that in building the workforce housing and having excess workforce housing, that somehow that could be used as a development or housing development right for other developers or builders in the future. And they're hoping to enter into a financial consideration agreement with Placer County or another entity where they could get compensation for this excess workforce housing right. And the specifics of that agreement are not clear at this point, but it's something we'd like to work on, but it would be a contingency in the agreement that this would be accomplished. So our next steps is to return with a purchase and sale agreement negotiated to both your successor agency board as well as the oversight board. The net proceeds of any sale would be distributed proportionally to the taxing entities, and there will be opportunity for public comment both with the successor agency board presentation and consideration, as well as the oversight board presentation. And then I'll also share with you that we would like to return to your board to discuss the other two properties, which would be Swiss Mart and Town Center South, where we would like to bring forth a broker agreement where we'd actually list these properties with a commercial broker. So the last thing is, if this does move forward as a project, there will be ample opportunity through a variety of measures for public comment, both on the purchase and, or the sale of the property by the successor agency, as well as any future housing or project built on this property. There'll be ample opportunity for public comment through a variety of measures. And with that, I will take any questions you might have.
Any questions from board members? Supervisor Montgomery.
Yeah, thank you. Eric, we received an email from Ellie Waller relating to this, and I've read it a couple of times, and I'm not actually quite sure how it relates to this item. I think it was actually intended for a different item, but did you have an opportunity to review that email?
I have not actually seen it. I've discussed it with Jennifer Merchant, and it's my understanding that she's trying to understand the pro forma of either it or the Kings Beach Center or the pricing of something, and I think she is maybe further advanced in her thoughts than where we are in our process now. So I think there'll be opportunity for her to express whatever concerns she might have at a later date, certainly if we bring forward the purchase and sale agreement.
Okay, it seemed to me like it was relating more to the questions of the Nexus study on the fee conversation we had earlier under agenda item 4A.
I agree, and I think that still needs to be fleshed out, so we're not necessarily sure where we're at with that also. But this, I think the buyer understands that at some point for this project, which is not residential, single-family home, there will be a workforce component.
Right, and this, looking at her kind of overall concerns, it appears that those concerns may be legitimate, but they will be addressed within the due diligence period.
I would think they would be addressed in the due diligence process.
Okay,
I mean,
thank you.
this project will need a pencil for the buyer.
Yeah.
And that's their opportunity during the due diligence to figure that out.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions from board members? Seeing none, is there anyone in the audience wishes to address this board on this issue? Seeing none, we'll bring it back to board for action.
I move that we, I'm just going to move agenda item 8A, 1 and 2.
Very nice. There we go. And is there a second?
Second.
No, second. All righty, the item has been moved and seconded for successor agency, Eastern Gateway Property 8776 to 8798 North Lake Boulevard, Kings Beach, negotiation and purchase and sale agreement. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? The item is moved. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And now we're going to adjourn as the Placer County Successor Agency and reconvene as the Placer County Board of Supervisors. And we'll take up item 9, Board of Supervisors minutes of September 25th, 2018.
Move approval.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded to approve the minutes of September 25th, 2018. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions?
Abstain.
One abstention. Thank you. We'll now adjourn to closed session.
I would like to make a statement, seeing this is the last Tahoe
Sure.
Board meeting. To all the folks out here in the Tahoe area, it's been my pleasure and honor to be on the Board of Supervisors and serve your community over the last 8 years. It's been a long and arduous journey. I know at times we've been pitted sometimes against each other, but I think most of the journey has been we've been walking together. It's kind of ironic at times that I get lectured, or I have been lectured by folks, when I grew up 10 minutes from here, in Homewood, and spent a lot of my youth in North Tahoe, as if I didn't know what was going on, or I didn't have an appreciation for this beautiful world, what I think is just an immensely valuable piece of property here in Tahoe that we all have an interest in preserving. So while the decisions that I made and have made over the last 8 years some people may or may not appreciate those. I can honestly tell you that I made those decisions with the best interests of the community as a whole. So as I go back into private life, don't be surprised if you see me around and a little bit more active, which could be a good or a bad thing depending on where I'm standing on a particular issue. So,
Thank you, Supervisor.
peace out.
Brown.
The board will now adjourn to closed session to consider two items. One is existing litigation item, and the second is a public employment item.
All right.
Okay. The board met in closed session to consider two items. Regarding existing litigation, Tate versus County, the board gave direction on this item. Regarding the public employment, the board gave direction on this item. This concludes closed session report back.
Thank you. And we are adjourned.